What am I doing wrong here?
Gee, Francis, what's the hullabaloo? Did one of the kids get out of the shed again?
No, nothing not quite that sinister, Kath. It's just this darn sandwich. No matter what I do, I just can't seem to force everything to stay within the confines and security of this here inoffensive white bread.
Gosh, Francis, that sounds, well, it just sounds awful. Have you tried stripping the turkey's rights?
Sure have.
Did you put the lettuce in charge of state-based media so that you and only you control the news narrative?
That was the first thing I did right after subjugating the tomato.
Well, it sounds like you just forgot the last, but maybe the most important ingredient.
What's that, dear?
Why, mayonnaise, of course.
Of course. How could I forget the glue of this whole dish? Thanks, honey. Now these dishes aren't going to do themselves. Back to it.
Whether you're attempting to establish a dictatorial fascist regime or just trying to make a good sandwich, remember, nothing spreads quite like the smooth, creamy tang of propaganda mayonnaise.
Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to a highly fixated review of large, dense books, specifically of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate. I'm one of the co-hosts.
I'm Cody.
And I'm Will.
And today, we're going to be discussing chapters 40 through 41 of Against the Day, covering pages 557 to 588. Luke, do you have a summary prepared for us?
Chapter 40. We open with the Quaternionists meeting with a weapons dealer. Freudian slip. However, there are other arms dealers hanging around Ostend. One of them sells a time weapon to Kit's nemesis, Piet Woevre. Kit and Umeki consummate their clear attraction to one another. The new couple encounter another couple, Piet and Pleiade. Then we get a short monologue from Dr. Rao concerning the beginnings of the Quaternion movement. Kit encounters Piet at his hotel and runs off. Brute and Umeki give chase. Pandemonium ensues. Rocco and Pino decide to get out of town. Kit joins them, and off they go to Bruges. The trio arrive in Bruges, and Kit is almost immediately attacked by Piet, who gets distracted by the arrival in the sky of the Chums of Chance. Piet decides to use his newly bought time weapon on the inconvenience, but when he fires the weapon, he is overwhelmed by voices and light. Kit goes over to check on him. Piet gives the weapon to Kit and then fucks off. Later, Umeki inspects the weapon and attempts to explain how it works to Kit. Next, Kit experiences a mathematical vision in a dream, and it becomes clear that the pair must part. So Kit takes a train away from Belgium at the end of the chapter, heading for parts unknown. Chapter 41. Dali and the rest of the Zombini family have arrived in Venice, which Dali has decided to make her new home. Luca searches for solutions to the problem that is his many doubles, all of whom were created by three-dimensional mirrors. There exist no real solutions, however, although we do find out a bit more about the Zombini family's ancestral history. Orlis and Luca discuss what to do about Dali's decision to stay in Venice. Eventually, they are forced to say goodbye to Dali and move on. Dali finds work as a busker, sleeping on the streets and posing as a boy. She meets a painter named Hunter Penhallow, and the pair begin to collaborate. Dali acts as his salesman and muse. It turns out that Hunter might be a time traveler. The pair grow closer and have a conversation about Hunter's living arrangements and his dreams. Then they have another conversation, this time about Gnostic and biblical stories. Hunter decides to switch from documenting Venice during the day to documenting Venice at night, and Dally adjusts her schedule to allow her to continue their friendship, although she does have ulterior motives. As a street urchin, she's often approached by men who wish to do her harm while trying to sleep. The tourist season ends, and Dally and Hunter decide to remain in Venice for the time being. Considering that winter is onrushing, Dally finds stable housing with Hunter's help. Bria shows up in Venice, and Dally and her half-sister reconnect and bond. Dally and Hunter join some of Hunter's painter friends on a boat trip through Venice. Dally finds herself particularly interested in Andrea Tancredi, one of Hunter's painter friends, so she repeatedly visits him at his studio, sometimes with Hunter, sometimes not. And at the studio, he often discourses on art and the nature of time while painting. The chapter ends with Dally hoping Tancredi will finally kiss her. Finito.
Thanks, Luke. I always appreciate your input. Anyway, what did you guys think about these chapters?
Oh man. Oh man. I realized in reading these chapters that I hate this book more than anything in the world because it's so
Damn.
good. I can't. I'll never accomplish anything of this magnitude. Like I just know that. Like I've had to make peace with it, and I just have to kind of sit back and enjoy the fact that we have this book at least for us to enjoy, because God damn it, it is phenomenal. Chapter 40 is good. It's great. Don't get me wrong, but 41 I think is like, if there was a thesis statement on what this book is about, it's chapter 41. I think pretty much everything, and I know we've said this many times in the past, but genuinely, like, this chapter is just the distillation of everything that this book is kind of building to and working at and getting at, and it starts to really open up the ideas that he's working with. It's some of the best prose throughout the book. It's just phenomenal. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about it. It's just wonderful.
So your personal theory on what Against the Day is really about is just the city of Venice as an
The city of Venice. Yeah, it's just about Venice. At the end of the day, it's a travel guide to the city of Venice.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. I feel similarly, although I would say that, like, the big thing that always points to me as I will never write anything this good, or sort of a perspective of, if I could write something even like half of this good, I would feel pretty successful as a writer, is the Boston AA segment of Infinite Jest. Like, that's the thing for me. But there are definitely moments in this book, and in these chapters where, like, you just are kind of in awe of his writing, like, for sure. And the nature of how he's knitting together his different plot lines, and not only keeping you invested in what is unfolding, but then is also paying off earlier things that he kind of laid the groundwork for. It's all very, very impressive. I wouldn't say that they're my favorite chapters that we've covered so far. I would say that the last episode's material with the Stupendica dividing and all the rest of that has probably been more so a favorite of mine. But these chapters really did fill me with a sense of, like, real intrigue over what is coming next, I guess, is the way that I would put it.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a couple of aspects of it that do stand out to me, as being amongst some of the best stuff that we've read. All the stuff with Hunter Penhallow in the second half is really great. And I actually had my first moment of, like, who the fuck is that? And I had to go back and revisit, because for some reason in my mind it was long enough ago now that I did not remember Hunter Penhallow was the guy who, like, found safety on some kind of, like, train car or machine of some kind that, like, transited him into the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I was glad that was pretty easy to find in my notes. But yeah, just a really enjoyable set of 2 chapters. Not as much research in terms of individual items, but each of the individual items that I had to research were very in depth And as soon as I was like, as soon as we were going through the second chapter for this episode and we were getting close to the end, I was like, all right, this one's like going to be pretty easy. And then the other painter shows up and he talks about the futurists, and I was like, oh, fuck off. I was like, there's like 2.5 pages left, because I already knew what the futurist movement was and its relation to like fascism. So that did kind of send me up a wall, but it made for an interesting evening of reading.
Yeah, I think if we're comparing how we feel, I'm closer to Kate on the end of things here. I definitely really appreciate these chapters from a language standpoint, and I really I agree basically what you're saying about chapter 41 kind of having looped all of the core emotional themes together at the very least, not more. Um, but these are the kinds of chapters that are really the you know as much as I love the snow blindness and the like headache inducing nonsense that are like the Chums of Chance chapters, where like all of the themes are literal and you know all of the literal events are metaphorized. I find that fun, but it's Kate, you've said it before. I think we've all said it at some point. That this book is a true testament to like the way that with some exceptions, this book broadly shows the overcoming of Pynchon of what his most traditional critics have to say for the negative. And these two chapters are really kind of the apotheosis of that. They are like these beautiful character pieces that do not slump in terms of like the thematic depth or in terms of like the plot intricacies, but it lacks that kind of, and not to criticize it because I love that kind of thing, but let's be honest, the mayonnaise factory, that kind of stuff is very silly. It's goofy and it's hard to take what's happening seriously when what you're reading about is some absurd like industrial accident. Um, mayonnaise, like that stuff's ridiculous. And then you get to chapters like this, and it's sure there's some kind of ridiculous features, but they're human ridiculousnesses, or they're like surreal ridiculousnesses. They're not high throwing in a hot air balloon type of absurdities. And just the depth of the I mean, it's not so much landscape description, but it is like the local geography, the depth of the description of local geography, and the depth of clarity in how like characters are expressing what they mean. I don't know how to put it other than that, is really impressive because he doesn't belabor it. He's not sitting, you're not reading like people like ruminating on their thoughts and feelings. No, you're reading people do things that show who they are in a way that makes sense. It doesn't feel like they're acting out on a stage, and it doesn't feel like you're looking into their head. It just feels kind of like, well, you understand what's going on, which is, you know, some might say the ideal, even if others would disagree. Pretty nice, pleasant.
Agreed. And it comes after like a sort of a long road to get there as well. Like, it feels like that is very much a payoff of everything that you have read through the nearly 600 pages to this point. To begin, I guess I should also say Luke is not here. I was gonna do my best to just keep that a secret, but then I laughed through the entirety of the segment where we were gonna try and pretend that he was here. So he's not here, but you will have heard his voice. My inability to sort of be a professional has killed that particular bit. But
I don't think anybody has ever accused the show of professionalism at any point in anything we've done, so I wouldn't worry too much about it.
Okay, so chapter 40 is the first one we're doing, right? Okay. Chapter 40 opens with the fact that the news of the Q weapon has sort of gone out into the world and infected the ears of every sort of arms dealer or private military corporation that's worth its salt. And all of them are now converging on this Quaternion conference in order to try and figure out where it is, who has it, and how much it costs. And this is where one of the three major things I had to research comes up, because the person who is talking in this scene, the very beginning, Victor Mulciber, makes a reference to a man named Basil Zaroff. Or Basil Zaroff, not Basil, like the seasoning. Basil Zaroff, who is a pretty major historical figure in terms of arms dealing and in manufacturing of weapons, and also in World War I. He was really a great example of sort of the beginning of the military industrial complex, how that was starting to form into a permanent industry as opposed to something that was either subsidized through government work or government contracts, or just was sort of done by the government, and how that kind of started to assert its eventual control over the whole world. But before he got to the stage where he's being referred to here, he was actually a con man, was a huge thing that he did. He had other odd jobs in between pulling cons, some as a shipping merchant, some as just sort of working in factories, some trying to recruit women in particular to work in U.S. factories. He was a salesman for a railway company. And then his sort of final con before he got a job in arms manufacturing was posing, I guess not really posing, but posing as a bigamist, which in the parlance of the time is the idea that you are someone who believes in being able to marry multiple women. So he would pose as a bigamist and marry sort of wealthy socialites and steal their money, or attempt to steal their money. And eventually he got caught doing this and had to kind of run away from America into Europe. And that is how he ends up working for Vickers and for Maxim after he kind of washes up onto the continent. So starting in 1897, he starts selling arms and munitions to the United Kingdom, to Germany, the Ottoman Empire, Greece, Spain, Japan, and the United States. He was widely known for his corruption and his deceit. Like, everyone dealt with him, but they all knew that he was effectively a used car salesman in terms of his moral scruples and what he was willing to do to kind of like get the best deal for him as opposed to his company. He was also the marketer for the world's first machine gun, submachine gun, and submarines. So when Vickers and Maxim created those individual products, he was the guy who went and tried to sell them. There's a really interesting history that you can read of his demonstrations of the Maxim machine gun, where all three of the major presentations he tried giving were sabotaged in one way or another. Either someone had messed with the actual weapon itself, someone had messed with the ammunition, someone had done both. And so it took a while for him to actually break through and start selling these off the back of the demonstrations that he was doing, because of the constant sabotage he was running into. And apparently this was very regular for arms dealing at the time. There are no, as far as I could find, theories as to who was sabotaging him and why. I think it's an interesting detail to include in a book like Against the Day, because the idea of like future denizens coming back in time to sabotage elements of industrialized warfare sort of matches with this idea of this like spontaneous subterfuge that he was constantly dealing with in quite an interesting way. He also tried completing demonstrations of 2 different steam-powered submarines, which is one of the sillier sentences that I've ever heard. The idea of having a steam-powered submarine was clearly not a great idea, because essentially the people who had helped develop this, along with the company that he was marketing for, was the U.S. Navy. They wanted the ability to create these steam-powered submarines, and they said that it was, quote, capable of dangerous and eccentric movement, which does not fill me with confidence, and should not have filled anyone in confidence with confidence that these would be sort of a positive development in warfare. And they weren't. He sold 2 of them successfully to the country of Greece. Both of them failed. Neither of them saw active combat. and they were decommissioned almost immediately. Some other schemes that he engaged in over the course of his time working for these arms dealers, or arms manufacturers, rather, he was an arms dealer, was manipulating the Spanish government into giving him 5 to 7% of every single arms deal, including the ones he was not involved in, bribing Admiral Fuji in the Siemens scandal with Japan, secretly buying... What?
So that could have been named better.
Yeah. Secretly buying stock in the company he worked for until he became an equal shareholder. Essentially, when the company had realized how much of an awful human being he was, and how he was really, in a very real way, like bleeding them dry, they went to fire him, and he basically said, "You can't fire me, I own most of this company," and then revealed that he had been purchasing individual stock shares through the entirety of the time that he had been working for them, to the point where he was an equal stockholder with the owners of the company.
Guys, he's a literal supervillain.
Yeah,
Like
he really is.
Amazing.
And then he also was considered one of the first people to sell weapons to both sides of a given conflict. So he was the first guy who had that bright idea. He is also oftentimes referred to as the Merchant of Death. Probably the first person on record to have been referred to that way. There's plenty of arms dealers that have been referred to since. However, as he gained in both power and influence, he actually purchased the Union Paris Bank and gained control of the popular French daily newspaper Excelsior, both of which he would use to supply himself with favorable loans for his own investments and for the arms companies that he worked with and partially owned, as well as propaganda for the arms trade. So if you want to talk about a guy who's vertically integrated, to borrow that sort of Pinchonian phrase, he's giving himself favorable rates of business. He's got control of the supply side. He's got control of the buy side, and he's controlling the media's sort of impression of the work that he's engaged in. During World War I, Vickers, through his sort of particular control, would produce 4 ships of the line, 3 cruisers, 53 submarines, 3 auxiliary vessels, 62 light vessels, 2,328 cannons, 8 million tons of steel ordnance, 90,000 mines, 22,000 torpedoes, 5,500 airplanes, 100,000 machine guns. And his positions in Vickers would bring him into close relationships with the prime ministers of both France and England. On one occasion, it is noted that Zaroff left, quote unquote, an envelope containing 1 million French francs on the desk of their prime minister that it was said was supposed to be used for, quote unquote, war widows. He was tasked with making sure that the Greeks entered into World War I on the side of the Allies. Here's where this shit gets crazy. And I can't underestimate what you need to brace yourself for here.
It hasn't been crazy yet.
The English prime minister goes to this arms dealer and he goes, "Hey, we want Greece to enter World War I." That's already insane. But then he said, "We would also like him to do it on the side of the Allies." Now, this was a problem because the king of Greece at the time was the brother-in-law of the Kaiser. So there is an immediate issue there. Zaroff goes to Greece, and he sets up a propaganda outfit that was disguised as a press agency. And he was able to successfully use that propaganda outfit to overthrow the king using his own prime minister in, quote, a few months. That is how quickly he destabilized a country.
Wow.
Utilizing promises of power to the prime minister and one press outfit that he started. The prime minister would then bring Greece into the war on the side of the British, who were the people who financially backed Zaroff's press office that he set up in the country. The British prime minister would go back to the well again later and task him with peace negotiations with the Ottomans to try and get them to leave the Central Powers and join the Allies. This would not happen. He was not successful. I would assume it was just a case of he worked a miracle last time. Maybe he can do it twice. And pretty much after that was when his influence in the war kind of started to dip as far as his personal involvement. After the war, though, he was a key figure in helping the lesser powers remake themselves. He would push for Greece and Venetios to get reparations from Turkey. He joined the precursor company that would later evolve into British Petroleum, or BP. And he also brought the casino business in Monaco back to profitability and asked for protections for Monaco to be placed in the Treaty of Versailles, which they were. So all around, just an absolutely insane historical figure that really goes to show the kind of deepening relationship between the governments, the private industry, and the military-industrial complex as it was kind of really getting going at this point, which I think really comes full circle in this chapter with the later quote about how the funds are always there, earmarked for usage.
Yeah.
It just, yeah, an absolutely insane historical figure to spend time reading about.
That's absolutely wild.
So he is there to try and find a way to purchase the Quaternion weapon, just like a lot of these other arms dealers that have showed up. And we get a sort of application of the Quaternion IJK to the fulfiller of the Trinity. And this is where I wanted to turn it over to Will as far as how you interpret this, because while I was able to get the kind of spiritual meaning of the Quaternions, I think, and of the factions that supported them in one of our previous episodes, the actual math and description of like how his themes fit into the scalar aspect of Quaternions, or how they map to the actual equations, that I feel like I don't have an amazing grasp on. So as our resident math guy, what do you think?
I'm not going to get super mathematically dense or honest, I guess. I'm gonna more talk about it like symbolically, because I think sure you can say that, and I'll just to flesh it out, I guess, as far as that's concerned. Essentially, just to remind anyone who is just tuning in or doesn't understand still what's going on with the Quaternions, the I, J, and the K are all essentially mirror images of one another, and they are a decomposition of this more traditional imaginary number I, which is defined as the square root of -1. Now, this is not a thing that happens in math. You can't have a square root of a negative number, and we get around that by defining I as something that we can do algebra with. And in real terms, what that kind of implies is something to do with rotation. And at this point in time, quaternions were being used as, or not at this point in time, prior to this point in time, maybe around the beginning of this book, but really at this point, as talked about, the vectors one as the more traditional way, you would use quaternions to model three-dimensional space. And when you're doing that at this point in time, when atherism is starting to decline and we're starting to get the very beginning inklings of of uh, uh, general relativity and the kind of mental models of space time that we now take for granted, almost to the level of like elementary school education. There were ways of framing quaternions as, well, what we would, again, in that not necessarily elementary school, but that like traditional educational sense of like a three-dimensional Cartesian coordinate graph where you have x, y, and z. You can easily synonymize I, J, and K to each of those. But that's strange because the whole point of quaternions is that, well, I times I equals -1, and I times J times K equals -1, and all of these things that are outlined in the text, thankfully. And so that -1 is this kind of base quantity of the scalar unit, the W, the non-vector unit. And of course, whenever you're talking for anyone who's not aware of how bullshitty algebra is, anytime you have a negative number like that, they tend to like to just ignore that there's one side of the equation and they zero it out. So it's, 0 equals I times J times K plus 1 kind of thing. Anywho, so the point is, once you do that and you're thinking about these things, as we've discussed a little bit with that kind of idea of time as this linear progression from the beginning of, let there be light to Jesus's return and the either before or after the 1,000 years of peace, however, the judgment day comes, that's the end of it. Then the zero, it's either a 0 on one end or it's a -1, which means that you kind of have to like shoehorn in this other idea, this kind of correct me if I'm wrong, Kate. This is something you're far more familiar with. Was it a medieval Christian concept of the Father as the world, the Holy Spirit as the people, or as like the time, and people as the sun, or is that something way more esoteric?
That would be more esoteric
All right,
than
thank you.
Christianity. Yeah.
All right, because I can't remember, because it's something like that though that it's
Mhm.
getting at, is this idea of you're taking the Trinity and you're using it as part of your model for space in such a sense that like that means that time is this outside feature almost, just through, I think, sheer like symbolic like mimesis. It's I, J, and K. Why not the Father, the Son, and the Spirit? I don't know if it's any deeper than that.
Sure.
But that's not deep, depending on how
Yeah.
far you want to go with it.
It also would seem to be pretty evident that there's some referential material to the creation of the atom bomb after the end of World War I and towards the end of World War II. There's a lot of details that were being added up from not just this chapter, but a couple of chapters over the course of the last 100 or so pages on the Pynchon Wiki that points to that. I remember when we were doing Mason and Dixon, you kind of pinpointed the crossing the warrior path element to the building of the Los Alamos laboratory. Do you see that same sort of influence on the approach of the atom bomb here, or would you say that it's going in a different direction?
I would say that it is exactly both of those things.
Sure.
It is exactly, yes, it is getting at the same kind of the notion of these inevitable tide changing weapons. Although this is like clearly something less militarizable, or at least not militarizable in our world, the way it's been described. But it is getting at something like the ways that truly theoretical things. Because like, imagine being, you know, Heisenberg theorizing about, quantum mechanics prior to World War II, like prior to like
Right.
1938 or whatever. There just wasn't. You were just a guy. You were essentially a mathematician. You didn't do anything that helped anyone. And then suddenly you were running the Nazi bomb program, and if he'd had, you know not killed all of his other scientists, probably would have won that race. Like
Yeah.
it's a crazy kind of thing to have this transformation from a purely theoretical notion to something that moves reality itself, like the
Mhm.
atomic bomb.
Yeah.
And I think on that level, it's very much the same idea, although it's not, with the whole warrior path thing, there's definitely a difference where with Trinity, the Trinity site was like historically sacred land to ancestral nations. And it's a little bit more material corruption of the earth, I think, than this is. But it's definitely getting at that same phenomenon in the way that at a certain point technology changes the
Mhm.
society around it.
Right. And certainly that idea of essentially inevitability, that even if you are doing these things theoretically or not towards a particular end, they are going to end up there whether you kind of want them to or not. In a way that I think is illustrated quite nicely here. Cody, what we're talking about is the talk about the idea of the fulfiller of the Trinity and the talk within like the long sort of discourse where Piet Hoover gets the weapon on 558 to 559.
Yeah, I couldn't really put it better than Will did. I also like I've made it more of an effort in this reading to try and really stick with the math of everything, and I just can't. I just my brain just can't make it work. But Will's summation of it kind of made a lot more sense and put it into a perspective that I hadn't really considered in the past. So, but I also think like simultaneously there is that whole aspect of it, right? Of that whole the math behind it and everything like that. But I think at the same time, in a sort of parallel way, it is also just kind of the cool sci-fi thing to have a time gun, you know, like. It's a concept that you would just kind of wouldn't really think about other than in dime store sci-fi novels, you know? And it's just like it's a cool little weapon to have and to hold and to kind of hold over people. And I love the fact that it's smaller than Wolf thinks it should be. Like it's almost unsettling to him how tiny the whole thing is. But we see later that it does have, you know, great power that it's able to utilize. But yeah, it's the Q weapon thing is a fascinating little section of this chapter.
Well, and so I guess that brings up a good question of, is it worth at this juncture? And you guys will have to answer this because I haven't read the book before. But is it worth at this juncture to speculate on what the Q weapon is? Because there is a lot of hand-wringing over that in the Pynchon Wiki, and there are certain descriptive elements of it that make it sound like it is a camera, but I doubt that it is just a camera, if it is at all. Is it worth talking about? Do you guys have theories on what it is, or is this just something that we should leave till later?
I would say just wait and see what comes, because I don't, as we've mentioned several times, the wiki for this book is wild, and I don't understand a lot of some of the back and forth just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So I would say I think it's worth at least speculating right now, especially as someone who hasn't read it before. It's interesting to see how you're kind of already putting it together and where you're going with it. And it'll be more interesting to see what you think as the story progresses and more is made of it. I kind of think that's the best way I can explain that.
Okay.
Yeah, so do you have any like concrete ideas of it yet, or amorphous ones?
Not really. I guess it does. The closest thing that makes any sense to me is that it is some kind of camera or photography device. That's been a major element of the book that we haven't had a return to yet for a while. And then also the idea of like it is described as something that is held open for a certain amount of time to let light in specifically, and like gauging the amount of light that is let in. That is very much what a camera does. When Hoover uses it, it flashes him. If the camera has a flash bulb attachment, then that would make sense. It being in a leather case, that's a pretty regular thing. Like I do think that there is enough detail to point towards some elements of it being photographic in nature. I don't have enough information to confirm that.
I guess the question then that I would ask is, do you want to know right now, or are you good waiting? Because you're like, I don't want to say anything. I don't want to mess with the way you've. I will say, continue thinking about it the way you've been thinking about it, though. That's as much as I'll put out there. It does. I think personally, I think it's made not necessarily explicitly clear, but it is. It's not hard to infer what it is that he's pointing at, and that's made more clear almost literally at the end of the book.
Okay, great.
So hang on for another 450 pages. Let him cook.
Yeah, I'll put my cards on the table. I don't actually remember exactly what it is. Like I remember the broad shape of how things are going to go with the Q weapon, but it's definitely it's put clearly. I remember that much, but I remember thinking I need to puzzle this out a little bit more. and then just never coming back to it. So it's definitely something that you can blink and miss, but
Okay.
I don't think we will.
So this first sort of section ends at the page break with the knowledge that Hoover has purchased the weapon and that he now has a single weapon able to annihilate the world. It says very ominous. Kit has fallen for Umeki, and we get treated to another sex scene in this book for the first time in a while, as he is apparently very fond of her at this point, and the two of them have taken up together. One day they run into Pleiade out on the Digay and over by the Hippodrome, walking around with Hoover. They exchange some fairly, I guess I'll say, icy remarks back and forth to one another before we reach kind of the fever pitch of the festival that all the Quaternianeers are here for, and that is the anniversary of the day that Hamilton went and carved his signature in the form of an equation into a bridge. And then there's a line here on 561 where it says, the assembly here murmuring along as to a revered anthem, and it is in this Pentecostal moment that the Quaternians descend to take up their earthly residence among the thoughts of men. Is that also what happened to the chums? Similar to my question a while ago with respect to the Candlebrow perspective. These things all sound very referential to what the chums have recently gone through in terms of the grand scheme of the book. Are the chums Quaternions?
It's an interesting parallel that you draw there. I don't know that I had really thought about it that way, but it makes sense.
I mean, yeah, I don't know if the chums are Quaternions, but I do think that, like, I mean, there's definitely an overlap there. There's definitely something about the way that, like, these just symbols can become so much to people, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, why not the chums? But I don't know if it's that one-to-one either. Just because, I
Yeah.
mean, yeah.
It's I think you could you've got me thinking on this now, and I think you could make the connection that they're both, like Will said, they're both symbols and they're both representations of something that is both real and not real simultaneously. So that could be your connecting point there.
Yeah, to be clear, I don't think that they're like literally I, J, and K.
No,
It's just that
yeah.
they by the same thematic space.
Yeah, thematically speaking, I think you're definitely right. I think they are basically like kind of opposite sides of the same coin almost.
I was just going to verbally digest that as the idea of, like, they are Quaternions in the sense that a Quaternion is a construct used to simplify life, and a character in a novel is meant to, create like a simulacrum of humanity for you to project your own contrary desires onto the not unreal world. And it's, yeah, just doesn't go anywhere. Just, yeah.
Does someone want to read the first paragraph of 561 after the page break? Because I love the sort of Scooby-Doo nature of what Pynchon writes after the festivity's over.
Yeah, I've got it right here. In the festivities, attending departure, romance, intoxication, and folly were so in command, and so many corridor doors opening and closing, so many guests wandering in and out of the wrong rooms, that De Decker's shop, declaring an official mischief opportunity, sent over to the hotel as many operatives as they could spare, among them Piet Hoover, who would rather have been working at night and towards some more sinister end. The minute he caught sight of Hoover, Kit, assuming he was the target of murderous intent, went running off into the hotel's labyrinth of back stairways and passages. Root Tubsmith, thinking that Kit was trying to avoid paying off a side bet made several evenings ago in the casino, gave chase. Umeki, who had understood that she and Kit would be spending the day and night together, immediately assumed there was another woman in the picture, no doubt that Parisian bitch again, and joined the pursuit. As Pino and Rocco, fearing for the security of their torpedo, ran off in panic, Policarp, Denis, Eugene, and Fateau recognizing any number of familiar faces among the police operatives swarming everywhere, concluded that the long-awaited action against young Congo had begun and went jumping out of various low windows and into the shrubbery. Then, remembering absinthe spoons, cravats, illustrated magazines, and other items it was essential to salvage, crept back into the hotel, turned the wrong corner, opened the wrong door, screamed, ran back outside. This sort of thing went on till after dark. In those days, it was the everyday texture of people's lives. Stage productions, which attempted to record this as truthfully as possible, like dramatic equivalents of genre paintings, became known as, quote, four-door farce, and its period at the golden age.
Just a lovely
chases
bit.
on chases on chases.
Yeah. And four-door farce was a type of sort of farcical screwball comedy at the time that you can go and read up on, and this is, from my albeit cursory understanding, pretty illustrative of how sort of wacky they were.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, Kit is just sort of roaming about, trying to figure out where he should do, what his life is going to be, headed in a direction of now. And suddenly, Pino and Rocco tell him that they're going to go back to Bruges and that they want to take him with. They offer him a ride. They get lost, though, and they somehow emerge out of a fog into like a completely deserted city. Before I get to the historical reference, because that's going to take fucking forever, because you could basically tell the history of Europe up to a certain point out of the historical reference. I just wanted to get your guys' impression on the setting of this encounter between Kit and Hoover. What do you make of the kind of nature of them seemingly drifting from a real space to a fictional one, or at the very least a different sort of reality? What intent do you think Pynchon has behind that? Very curious setting for what's about to happen, especially with the fact that it seems as though Hoover sees the chums in this city.
So I'll pick up from that last part you mentioned, because that's something that I guess I don't remember from previous readings. Is that connection to the chums that it's almost explicitly stated there. He's it seems somehow to be about the Italians and their man torpedo. That was in the message which had come from the office earlier in the day. So it seems like he's working against the chums, because every time he risked to glance upward, it was there directly above him, thing he'd been seeing for days. It certainly seems like this was a sort of ambush in a way, like he had been hunting the chums and took an opportunity to see Kit. Doesn't really seem to care that he's got the wrong person. Like Kit even says at one point, you've got the wrong person. He's like, I don't give a shit. And I will say though, like this is like from a writing standpoint, this is one of my favorite scenes in this chapter. It's just so tense and so fun to read. This kind of shootout scene where Kit's hiding and Hoover's just kind of taking pot shots at him as often as he can. It's a fascinating scene, and yeah, the chums part is what really got me, because I hadn't really recalled that from my previous readings. I don't know how, but that's kind of been my focus on this section of this chapter, at least.
Yeah, I have a really hard time making much coherency out of it. Like there's something is happening, and it doesn't feel incoherent, but it definitely isn't something that I can put into my own words at all. Like it's a really captivating passage for sure, and it's getting at things that it's getting at things that both we have and have not yet seen in this book that are, I think, in a really a very, I wouldn't say quite satisfying, but a thrilling way for sure. And it just kind of comes to this point where it either you can figure it out or you can't. I think, I don't know. Again, and for me right now, I can't figure it out.
So I'll try to take a crack at kind of summarizing what I think is going on, at least as far as the plot points here. It's basically Kit and Rocco and Pino have met up. Rocco and Pino are getting out of town. They're going to Bruges. somewhere along the way, they end up in a different area that's kind of described as a port town, but full of canals and things like that. In his time briefly there, he runs into Hoover, who we find out in the middle of the scene is actually looking for the chums. Hoover starts shooting at Kit. Kit tells him, "You've got the wrong guy." Hoover says, "I don't care. You'll work for now." Then realizes, like, he seems to have this sort of like fugue state in the middle of this shootout. I shouldn't even call it a shootout because it's really just him shooting at Kit. But he sort of goes into a fugue state, remembering that he's really on a mission to find what's at least implied to be the chums, and he is meant to find their airship and bring it down by whatever means necessary. He believes that he sees the ship while he's there, and decides that this is the right opportunity to use his newfound Q weapon. Doesn't know how to use it. Doesn't know how it even works. If it needs ammo, if what ammo it would need if it does need ammo, but just goes ahead and tries to figure it out in the moment, and ends up creating a brilliant flash of light that leaves his field of vision a luminous green, and then it kind of knocks him out for a moment. Kit finds him, takes the device, the Q weapon away, and then kind of just wanders off and has the Q weapon now. This is where this is why earlier I was having to I don't want to say more about the Q weapon and its nature until later, but this is where it kind of, I think, starts putting itself together. And that's why I say keep on with your thinking as far as what you were going at, Kate.
Sure.
Because I think you're definitely in the right area there.
Okay.
So yeah, it's basically, if you want to look at it through that lens, it's in a shorter version of that. Kit and the other two boys, the torpedo boys, are going to escape to
The
Bruges.
torpedo boy.
Get lost along the way. End up in a like a port town, get in a shootout. Kit meets a crazy person who's trying to shoot him. Crazy person breaks down, thinks he's seeing flying ships, and using a device that he's never used before, basically tries to bring it down and only hurts himself in the process.
So my response in terms of what I think is going on is unfortunately going to include the historical context behind the Hanseatic League.
I'm curious for the historical part of this.
So, but I think it's also interesting that when you go into that quote about him noticing the airship, I actually didn't read that as it turns out that he had been looking for them, but that he had been being followed and had been seeing the ship above him for a long time. And then in that moment, he was like, oh God, it's descending. I have to destroy the ship. Not so much that his mission the whole time was, but that he's suddenly now kind of perceiving a threat now that he's holding on to the Q weapon. And I think that there is a potential reading that this moment symbolizes either the chums turning away from whatever kind of dark power they serve in the form of their broader organization, or illustrating a conflict between the kind of organized industrialization of the past in terms of the chums, because they are very much allies to power in terms of whatever it is that their organization is involved in, and who they regularly work for and help out, versus the rise of private industry and the destruction that wreaks, in terms of Hoover being an individual who has lived in both worlds. He's served the Garde Publique in the Congo, but he's doing his mission to obtain the Q weapon on spec for like a private organization. And the backdrop of that being this Hanseatic city, this abandoned Hanseatic port, speaks to a hollowing out of Europe's past by the arrival of the industrialized future in the form of World War I fascism, eventually the Nazis, which of course has a link to Gravity's Rainbow in a very real way, and all of the things that book it speaks to. I understand that's a lot, but I promise we're going to get there through the perspective of this historical reference. So there's a reference here to the Hanseatic League, which was at one time a dominant force in multinational trading and industry for hundreds of years. I'm talking like from the 1300s technically through to 1938.
Holy shit.
They reached their height, though, in the 1400s. That was their sort of glorious epoch. These were essentially wealthy landowners that, for the first time in history, decided that they were going to form essentially trade unions, something that definitely prefigures like a mine owners association, to use another historical reference that's very relevant to Against the Day, where they banded together in these small enclaves that were not associated with the government that they sort of paid taxes or tribute to, but that instead were sort of independent. So this idea of these Hanseatic cities, as they grew from these tiny little enclaves or these tiny little unions into actual cities that had both an allegiance to the League and to the nation that was hosting them, that what they're really representing is not the country they're from. So the idea that they are crossing over from like the city of Ostend into this Hanseatic city also really represents a exiting from the national identity and the nation they're in, but then also into what was effectively a trade union or a private identity in terms of what the city represented. And so they would work together to create favorable trade routes, to pay protection for those trade routes, for basically toll roads that they would set up, for sort of ownership of ports. A lot of these cities were on the ports, and to actually utilize the port, you had to pay them taxes or tributes. To eventually intermarriage with the actual hierarchy of the country in terms of either its monarchy and its royal family or its governmental system, as well as an alliance with the Catholic Church, so that they could start at this private level. Hey, I'm going to deal with you, and because we're both a member of this league, we're going to give each other favorable terms, to the national level of, we are now going to be influencing public policy to make things easier for us, the merchants union, the trade union. But of course, these are not miners in Colorado. These are people who started as wealthy landowners and just continued to expand their wealth. Over time, they would develop this close interdependency with their host nations in both economic terms and eventually militarily. They would play a significant role in protecting and organizing trade routes throughout the entirety of the Baltic Sea. A lot of their territory was the Baltic in particular. And eventually their headquarters, or what was the closest thing to their headquarters in terms of the fact that this was kind of a series of independent unions or series of enclaves spread over multiple nations, would be set up in Lubeck. And that would be a major trading and supply post for the Northern Crusades, where the Catholic Church was sending missionaries and soldiers up into the remaining pagan nations to forcibly convert them to Christianity or kill them. So it becomes this central place where those missionaries and that military is getting supplies from this merchants guild, and a place for them to rest and kind of get safe passage into these Northern Crusades. This then would also bring the union, the league rather, really, really close to Catholicism in general. And they became just as interlocked as the governments were of the nations they operated out of, and that they made these deals with through marriage. And so now, again, if we're talking vertical integration, you got everything. You have the trade routes on land, you have the trade routes in the sea, you have access to the ports, you have toll roads, you control everything. you're in the favorability of the church, which was just as big of a deal as the state, and you got them too. So essentially, they're able to grow as this vestigial organ on like Central and Northern Europe for years and years and years and years, not unlike the Ottoman Public Debt Administration that we talked about from earlier in the book. They're just sucking money and taxes, and because of the fact that they've negotiated these favorable deals for themselves and are providing weapons and money and military support to the nations they sit in, those nations are all too happy to let them continue to do that. As this continues, Lubeck is eventually granted the status of an imperial city of the Holy Roman Empire. Most of its members, as I mentioned, began as landowners, but their wealth would be expanded, greatly beyond their wildest dreams through an alliance with the League. And eventually this period of like growing prosperity leads to what is described in more than one historical source that I found as a complete monopoly of the Baltic Sea. That it was impossible for you to move troops, your own trade and your own goods, your own imports or exports, anything through the Baltic Sea without paying them a toll or a usage fee or dealing with them in some regard. This leads to the first of multiple wars that the Hanseatic League are involved in. The Danish Hanseatic War goes from 1361 to 1370. And what happened is the King of Denmark invades Gotland, and he sacked a Hanseatic city called Visby. The League sees this as overly aggressive and declares war. So a merchants' trade union declares war on the nation of Denmark. And they raise their own private navy. They raise their own private army from these different enclave cities to fight against Denmark. Now, of course, this is a bad idea for multiple reasons, and they lose horribly. Like, it's not even close. Like, Denmark wipes the floor with them. But they don't manage to wipe them out completely. Now, it is true during this time that historians think that the Hanseatic League was so humiliated that they had considered disbanding, and that they had been so brutally defeated in these couple of conflicts with the Danish army that they were considering giving up, but they didn't. And it was a good thing that they didn't, because instead of collapsing, they chose to form an alliance with Sweden, Mecklenburg, and Holstein to attack Denmark back. So they gather forces and they put together a counterattack after this initial series of conflicts. And this was successful because King Valdemar, the Danish king who had started this whole thing with his invasion of Gotland, was dealing with a revolt internally in Denmark with the nobility. They didn't like him. And so his sort of efforts and his ability is split, and he's not able to manage the Hanseatic League as well as he should because he's not expecting it to be difficult. But now they've got all this juice behind him, and so they end up winning. And so as a result of this, Denmark is defeated in this brief war, and it would not only gain sort of recognition back for the League, but it would also prove that the League was capable of defending itself militarily, which becomes a really big problem if you realize that there is now this vestigial organ eating up money out of your treasury, and it's now gaining the ability to fight. And so what happens is the League basically demands favorable conditions in the new sort of Danish occupied Gotland, and that these contracts have like a null end date. Like, they just go forever. They're not going to have to renegotiate the trade contracts with them as long as they have control of the land. And this is the first time that we start seeing historians refer to the Hanseatic League as a great northern power. So again, this is just a union of loosely allied merchants, business owners. That's all this is. And they have built themselves into this great northern European power. Ultimately, though, their demise would be caused by gaining that sort of tag to themselves. That in getting so big, in being able to defend their interests, in gaining the monopoly that they did, with that comes basically institutionalization. That what used to be sort of freely operating independent cells now needs a hierarchy. And so they start building structures, and the sort of complexity of how the organization operates gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it gets harder and harder to maintain. And after a certain amount of time, people start to get tired of this monopoly that they have on the Baltic Sea and the trade that goes in and out of it. And the first time that this is officially threatened is when the Kalmar Union is signed, which basically united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden underneath one monarchy. So they were able to kind of set aside their differences. And now you have a big enough force where if you want to, you can challenge that monopoly on the Baltic trade routes that the Hanseatic League has. And it also allows you to really influence who is going to be allowed kind of in the party, so to speak, of who's going to have influence in your government. And one of the first things that the Kalmar Union does is basically boots the Hanseatic League out of all of their politics because they don't need them anymore. They can trade freely with each other. They still have to use the Baltic, yeah, but they don't rely on league traders to go across the borders between these three countries safely. They can just deal independently. And the second monarch of the Kalmar Union would completely sort of break whatever trust might have remained between those three countries and the League by putting a tax on their vessels. So the second monarch comes in and he says, hey, now that we've kicked you out, you actually owe us money because this has gone on long enough. And so the League decides to mull over the thought of going back to war, realize that's not going to end up kind of working out. And so what happens is they basically shut down the trade routes. They set up a blockade. They fight a couple of battles, but nothing too crazy. And this blockade is successful in repelling the Kalmar Union. And part of that is they get lucky again. In the same way that there is a revolt in Denmark of the nobility, the Kalmar Union starts to waver because there's a revolt in Sweden. That's a huge part of Swedish history that I can't get into in this particular podcast without the scope of what I'm already doing going into the stratosphere. And so because, again, there's this split loyalty, and now the Kalmar Union has to rally around itself to kind of heal the division in Sweden if it's going to keep this kind of like glorious three-state solution alive. They need to focus on that. They can't focus on the blockade. The blockade is successful, and terms kind of go back to normal. The taxes is taken away. A third war would break out only 5 years after this one, except this time it's with the Dutch. The Dutch were a rising force in European politics at the time. They wanted access to these trade routes. They wanted to do so independently. They didn't want to deal with the League. And so previously, they were completely blocked access. Like they couldn't utilize the sea trading routes. They weren't a big enough customer for the Hanseatic League to care. So they were just shut out completely. But now that they're a rising star in European politics, they want to get onto the sort of bigger playing field. And so they decide to declare war on the Hanseatic League. This is another short-lived conflict. None of these really run too long, maybe a year, maybe two. But the war ended when the King of Denmark was forced from the throne, and peace was negotiated with Christopher of Bavaria, which was the third monarch of the Kalmar Union. So again, they just keep getting lucky, but it's getting shakier. They're getting threatened more often. People are unhappy. The foundations of what they've put together are starting to kind of crumble underneath the weight of what they've actually built. And so the terms of the settlement at this third war gave both the League and the Dutch free trading rights, and the latter gained access to the Baltic. The League agreed to this sort of peace proposal because of the heavy reparations that the Dutch agreed to pay to them, but it was essentially them acquiescing a portion of their monopoly because they accessed for the first time in another nation free trading rights to the routes that they had previously controlled. So they're thinking, oof, this is a lot of money, this is a lot of reparations, a lot of things we're going to get back. But the whole basis of their empire now has a notch taken out of it. And from there, it's just kind of a feeding frenzy. And what starts to happen is kingdoms change hands, royal families die out, revolts happen, the Protestant Reformation happens, the fall of the Kalmar Union happens. And so the League finds its influence failing simply because the old structures, the old pillars of European government are beginning to topple, and things are getting unstable, and things aren't going to work out any longer because the people they were dealing with, the people they intermarried with, the people they set up these long-term contracts with, they're dying and they're getting replaced. And the League is so old, and these deals that they negotiated hundreds of years ago, in some cases, are so old that there's just no one there to contact anymore. And so, again, the influence is falling. The house is beginning to fall apart. The structure's crumbling. And what essentially destroys them is the 30 Years' War that breaks out in 1618 and lasts until 1648. And again, I spent like 4 hours reading about the 30 Years' War. I can't get into it with you. Because again, it will expand the scope of what we're talking about way beyond what is necessary. But it would not be inaccurate to say that the 30 Years' War was the World War I of the 1600s. That it came about as a result of treaties between nations, long-standing divisions between different cultures, and just a buildup of this unstable element in European politics that is leading to the fall of the Hanseatic League. The difference, of course, between them is the kind of private interest aspect of World War I that we have spent a lot of time talking about in past episodes, but it is not inaccurate for you to view that as the World War I of that era, because it decimates everything. Untold death numbers, untold wounded, whole swaths of land destroyed. Europe is going to have to rebuild itself after the 30 Years' War is over. And by that point, with all of the destabilization beforehand, with what the war does, and then some randomly internal disagreements over what to do about Poland. Like I read a bunch of like policy arguments between Hanseatic League officials over Poland in a way that I didn't really. It just didn't seem like something that would matter that much. But Poland was becoming a rising star. The Polish people wanted access to some more trading routes and was expanding out, and the League just didn't know what to do. So this is also a case where their kind of independent structure is working against them. And then shortly after that, they get expelled from London. So England says, "We're done with you. Get out." Their steel mill burns in the Great London Fire, that important historical event, and League members don't really want to raise the funds to pay to rebuild it. Again, territory continues to change hands, trading posts are destroyed, and by the time all of this kind of builds up, despite the fact that they are included in the peace at Westphalia that ends the 30 Years' War, no one really cares about them anymore. There is such bigger fish to fry, huge issues to deal with on a continental level, that the Hanseatic League is kind of this, not unlike the Ottoman Empire was in World War I, this like old man of Europe that is just sort of limping along. And so the last meeting of any officials from the Hanseatic League in Lübeck is recorded as being in 1669. Not everyone attended. Those who did come, like I mentioned, were reluctant to send any money to reconstruct the steel mill that burned in the Great Fire of London. And the League, while it would never formally disband, they never called it quits. They just silently disintegrated. What remained of them would slowly be dissolved by the founding of the North German Confederation in 1867. Most of their major cities were in Germany or were in German territory. And so as they're kind of reconstituting this new map, they don't want to deal with them. They kick them out. And then eventually this gets worse with the founding of the German Empire in 1871. Hitler would be the final blow to the League, as I mentioned, when he forced its capital city of Lübeck into the nation of Germany by revoking its independent status through the Greater Hamburg Act in 1937. This has also widely been seen as an act of revenge over the city council banning him from campaigning there when he was running for chancellor and for president. Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck would retain the term Hanseatic City in their official city names until German reunification happened in 1989. So the Hanseatic League is this huge thing that you can really, as I mentioned, tell a good chunk of European history through the history of. But it's also important, as I've kind of hinted at, to the respect that it is like the first historical example we've read about in this book of these moneyed interests, these private interests, these wealthy mine owners or landowners or capitalists effectively coming together to protect their own interests and then also to influence politics in their direction. And they're destroyed. They're all gone because they, if anything, made the fatal mistake by being too removed from the politics of the nations that they operated in. Because at the end of the day, they were really only interested about their own money. But they do kind of represent this precursor to the capital T they idea that Pynchon works with. They're allied with institutional power, but they try to float above them. Where the League is differing from what we deal with now is that they get destroyed by warring nations within the European nobility and within warring nations in the European continent. And so their single-minded focus on trade and self-protection could not keep them safe when the actual routes and nations they operated in went up in flames. The way that this gets turned into the conflicts against the day and Pynchon's work as a whole is due to what the capital T they would learn from this mistake, that they could protect against war by investing in war and further protect themselves by integrating and ingratiating themselves with how the governments themselves operated. But then the profit motive shifts to war itself, especially after World War I, and the rest is history, especially building towards the atom bomb like we had just talked about with the previous pages in relation to what the Q weapon is. And so to me, like, contextually in the background of this scene is this push and this pull between the old, dead, prior conception of the capital owning class in Europe and the creation of the new, in part through clandestine operations. And then hovering above all of that is sort of the old allies with power that the Chums of Chance seem to represent in terms of the organization they work for, watching as sort of powerlessly to stop what is playing out beneath them, which is an element of this new industrial era, this new future, this new capitalist age, begins fighting on the grounds of the old one. That's what I got for you guys.
Listen, every time you do one of these historical deep dives, I'm not gonna lie, I sit here like riveted, and then you finish, and I'm like, well, now I have to go learn about the Hanseatic Empire. Now I have to go learn more about the 30 Years' War. So I'm like, after every episode when you have these long tangentials about these historical events, like I literally go and I find nonfiction books about these things so I can like really read up on them. So I think I'm gonna like start a campaign to have you given an honorary doctorates in history, in world history, because I like this is like it's like getting a college lecture each episode. I love it. I really, really do.
Thank you, Cody.
Apologies, I am simply compiling information.
Sure.
While Will's doing that, somewhat, well, I mean, still read the book. Is there? Okay, I don't know if I've just completely missed this over the last rereads that I've done. Is there a particular reason Hoover is speaking in Afrikaans?
I wrote that it is an interesting element that he is crying out in the language of the people he is oppressing.
Yeah.
So what I read that as is like there is a thematic attempt to unite him in that moment to the people that he is oppressing by having him utilize probably the same language that he has heard them cry out in.
he understands
constantly.
it in their moment of plight. That's how they react, and that's his instinctual reaction. Okay,
That's
makes
my
sense.
assumption, especially given the fact that the Q weapon seems to like effectively reveal his karmic debt or his like soul to him in that moment that it flashes him. Which I guess if like it's a camera's meant to be sort of a reflection of you if it's a portrait, and so looking at yourself from an external source would potentially put you in the mind space of what that external body has done to other people. That's just off the top of my head right now, but maybe that's what the weapon does. But that could be why he's in particular shouting in Afrikaans instead of Dutch. Do we have anything else that we want to put for the scene where Kit obtains the Q weapon? Or do we feel pretty good where we're at with that?
I got nothing else.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's much to be done unless unless Cody wants to, break the spoiler wall, explain things more.
No, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
All right. So Kit brings Umeki the Q weapon, and Umeki gets obsessed with it. She begins taking it apart and trying to figure out what it is that it actually is. There is a reference to it containing a true icosahedron.
Icosahedron, a D20.
That's a D20, yeah. So that's what's inside, and it looks something like a Riemann sphere. This is another case where I'm going to go to my old pal Will and ask if you have anything to add in terms of what Umeki is talking about the weapon containing, or what these elements may be pointing to. And if this is another spoiler wall situation and you don't want to talk about it yet, that's fine. We can move on.
No, it's not. Essentially, so just to clarify, the Riemann sphere framing is Kit's trying to figure it out. But basically, if anyone listening is familiar with how SLR cameras or reflecting telescopes or similar kinds of devices work, essentially that's what this is on the simplest possible level. So what's happening is that for as far as the eyepiece is concerned, things are going in and things are being polarized and then split using half silvered glass lenses, which are then being recombined before being put into the eyepiece. And the lens is essentially a like it's a D20 shaped or not shaped, the size of an eyeball that is essentially the crystal attributes of this icosahedron are basically impossible. You can't have something made out of what it's made out of and have it be a perfect icosahedron crystal, because that just doesn't happen on a chemical level, I think is what's going on. I'm not a material scientist, but I think that's what it's getting at. And essentially that means that in like a punning kind of way, this is a thing that is projecting this these like four-dimensionalized versions of the one dimension of light coming in, or 3 dimensions of light being projected into 2 dimensions onto this icosahedron, which is then being split in a way that like, because of the way that the four different the line that gets highlighted in the Pynchon wiki, that just kind of has question marks. Let us say each of the 4 states is associated with one of the 4 dimensions of Minkowskian space-time, or in a more trivial sense, the 4 cusps of the surface reciprocal to that of the wave. What Quaternionists is called the index surface. Essentially, the because this crystal is projecting this across these like 4-poled polarizations, it's creating this kind of imaginary, like the idea is it's it's projecting a globe into like an eyepiece is kind of the idea, I think. And that's punning there with the Riemann sphere because this crystal can't exist. And so a Riemann sphere is essentially this idea that if you're going to try and represent a function, like in the same way that you might represent a function on a graph, that it might be easier to conceptualize certain complex functions over time as looking at a sphere where the real term, complex numbers are a real scalar term and then an imaginary scalar term combined. And usually they're projected as a polar graph where 0 is at the middle, and then you can only have like positive inputs on one or the other. But the Riemann sphere allows you to have essentially this kind of this model where 0 in the complex plane is at the very bottom and infinity is at the top, rather than some kind of hypothetical continuation. And I don't know what that means. I mean, like the book kind of gets at, like, maybe we're meant to ignore the optics altogether.
Yeah.
But at which point,
totally valid.
Yeah.
I don't know what we're supposed to get out of it if you're not supposed to do this and sit down and like try to puzzle out the optics of it, other than to just look at it as a pun, and not just as a pun, but to look at it as a pile of symbols. Does that help at all?
I mean, and I think that so much of Pynchon's work, but also this book, deals with piles of symbols in a sense that, like, a lot of these people, especially at this time, overlapped multiple sort of disciplines, multiple beliefs, multiple like methods of research or disciplines that they worked in, or any number of things. Like the amount of historical figures you look at from this book, and it was like, oh yeah, he was an anthropologist, and he was also a spiritist, and he was a reverend and a librarian, and he also, like, there is a lot of, I think, noise in general that is coming out of the symbology of this book, and that feels very purposeful. I don't know if I have a developed theory around that yet, but it definitely is just part of this book. Like it's part of all of the stuff that Pynchon is throwing at his reader.
I think it definitely could be, and probably is that. I wouldn't put it past him to have set this whole thing up, this part of it at least, as a sort of like, not necessarily return to, but like it would be, I guess, really clever, and it would make sense if at the heart of what he was doing was kind of this duality of the importance of and the danger of obsessing over symbols and symbology, because that's kind of that's pretty much what Lot 49 was, right? It's all the how latching on to that symbology, whether or not there's any actual truth behind what it is you're interpreting, can lead to dangerous places and to an over obsession. But at the same time, it can be super important, and you can gain a lot from it. So it would make sense if there was that sort, if he was playing with that duality in this book, particularly of the pros and cons of that in that device itself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, I think the other thing that's interesting is like this portion that Will is reading some quotes from, and that eventually leads into the big quote from 566, is we're getting back into Iceland spar again, like the double refracting crystals. And at this point, that is one symbol that means so fucking much.
Yep.
Over the course of what you read in the last division line in the book, like that Iceland spar section, that like the entropy of this book is increasing in a way that the referential material is decreasing, which has some resonance with the stuff with the Jesus parable later. This idea of like making order out of chaos. This book, in a certain way, especially through bilocation so far, is doing the same thing. They like the entropy, the lengthening of this book is obviously ongoing, and it's getting more complicated. But the referential material of it is getting less complicated in that he is just leaving one line or not even using the phrase Iceland spar, just refracting crystals. But because of that one simple line, the amount of like data that dumps into the reader's head, if they've been paying attention to this point, has increased so significantly from where it was 300 pages ago.
Yeah.
But that, of course, leads to this long quote on 566, which is really another case of like a synthesis taking place, or of Pynchon uniting a lot of his themes together, where it says, "In a dream early one morning, she stood before him holding the object. She was naked and weeping. Must I then take up this dreadful instrument and flee to other shores?" Her voice, without its waking edge of cool sarcasm, defenseless, beckoned him into its sadness. The dream was about Umeki, but also one of those mathematicians' dreams that surface now and then in the folklore. He saw that if the Q waves were in any way longitudinal, if they traveled through the aether in any way like sound traveling through air, then among the set of further analogies to sound, somewhere in the regime, must be music, which immediately, obligingly, he heard or received. The message it seemed to convey being deep among the equations describing the behavior of light. Field equations vector and quaternion equations lies a set of directions, an itinerary, a map to a hidden space. Double refraction appears again and again as a key element, permitting a view into a creation set just to the side of this one, so close as to overlap, where the membrane between the worlds in many places has become too frail, too permeable for safety. Within the mirror, within the scalar term, within the daylit and obvious and taken for granted, has always lain, as if in wait, the dark itinerary, the corrupted pilgrim's guide, the nameless station before the first in the lightless uncreated, where salvation does not yet exist. Like that, this is one of those cases where it's just, I'm never going to write anything as good as that. His talent is so incredibly off the charts, but it's also this beautiful synthesis of everything else that we've been reading, where like if you're really struggling to get this book, it Pynchon offers you a real big hand here to synthesize everything that comes together. That there is, within all of this math and science and referential material, these sort of two worlds. One is dark, one is light, and the walls between them, the dige, so to speak, is thinning, and they're at danger of crashing into one another. It's one of those things where, like, because of how revealing it is to what's going on with this book thematically, it'd be real easy to mess something like this up, where it would feel like you are cramming information down the reader's throat, or hammering your ideas home too hard, or being too on the nose. But it manages to, again, in that way that I'm talking about of entropy increasing but complications decreasing, it manages to do so in reference to other material that you should have been paying attention to already, where it does put these things together, it does reveal something to the reader, it does help them, but they are also only going to be sort of as helped as they have been dedicated to the work of understanding this text. It's a real tightrope you have to walk to craft something like that, and the implications that it has, but Pynchon walks it not just here, but time and time again. And I think it goes to show, like, if our theories about this book are correct and that he was writing it, for the better part of the 1900s, then, all of that work is certainly worth it for the result that it ends up leading to.
Here in that section and leading up to it, you kind of get another prelude of the atom bomb revelation, right? This realization that in this case we're taking for granted aether, but the substitute it for space-time. The idea that, as it's described here, reading Lorentz' paper in the Proceedings of the Amsterdam Academy, they have concluded that a solid body passing through the aether at a high speed can become slightly shorter. That's roughly the Doppler effect taken to the extent of general relativity. And so that combining with this, it is getting at it is a fictional kind of prefiguring of the whole, as has become at this point trite, the whole I am become death, destroyer of worlds thing from the standpoint of Oppenheimer, right?
Mhm.
That's what that is it's Kit realizing this is what we're doing. We are using one of these two sets of tools, however many you want to use. You're always going to be able to find a way to reinvent something like this Q weapon that will destroy the world if you really, you know, want it to, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it is as somber as that, you know?
Yeah, that one weapon to destroy the world. I guess maybe in that way, perhaps that is the dark and the light of that equation of the Q weapon and the atom bomb. But who knows? I've not read this book before. This leads Umeki and Kit to part ways, unfortunately. Umeki's going to hold on to the Q weapon and she's going to bring it back to Japan to be looked at by one of the people that she works with, to see if they can learn anything else. And the two of them sort of part ways, but not before realizing that neither of them really knows what home is for them at this point. That they've sort of become orphans in a sense from the place that they've come from, and one of those just very resonant themes in terms of Pynchon's writing of characters and of people, like what Will said at the top of this episode.
Yeah. Well, and also before we move on to the next section here, I think there's an important little piece of dialogue that Umeki has that ties into what Will was talking about with this idea that there's always going to be that one weapon. And so on 567, she says she's talking about seeing Madame Butterfly, the Puccini opera, and she says, "Is it that Japanese do die of shame and dishonor, but Americans don't? Maybe can't ever die of shame because they lack the cultural equipment, as if somehow your country is just mechanically destined to move forward, regardless of who is in the way or underfoot." If that doesn't summarize the idea of like the progress of science, regardless of the cost of doing so, as being a very American concept, I don't know what else does. It's not to say that other countries or other cultures haven't used scientific breakthrough to cause untold havoc and harm, but I think not to brag, but I think the U.S. kind of has a pretty steady lead on doing that historically at this point. So that I found that conversation, as brief as it was, to be really, really important to this particular chapter and what he's working at, kind of explaining here.
Do you have any theories as to what the sort of dream about Kit flying away on an airship is referring to, or is this more spoiler territory?
Yeah, I don't want to get into that.
Is Will compiling?
Will is trying to think of how to phrase exactly that. I don't know, the Madame Butterfly bit is an interesting reach because it is entirely contrary to, I think, how anyone watching the opera today would take it. But obviously, it's getting at something very real there, and it's another one of those wonderful things that, like, Pynchon was ahead of the curve in terms of recognizing that if you have like one piece of media shown in one culture versus another the same media shown in a different culture, they can read entirely differently. And obviously, it wasn't news to anyone in the 50s and 60s, but it was something that people took for granted as like, well, they're too stupid or they don't understand it. And post 50s, people started to understand that no, they just understand it differently. And it is such an interesting, like, almost like, and Pynchon never does this. It's almost like a weird, like, reverse psychoanalytic reading of of Umeki, like reading herself to Kit, I guess, because of how specific of an interpretation of Madame Butterfly that is.
Yeah.
For anyone who's unaware, it is broadly a story of an American military captain coming to Japan, marrying a widow because he can, because it's cheaper than hiring prostitutes every night, essentially, and then fathering a son and promising that he'll be back, and never really coming back, and it's just kind of that story. So to take this like grand historical technological read of it is one where, she is clear, like, again, modern day, you look at someone like Umeki and you say, well, this is someone with autism. This is I'm not even as a joke, but it's just like this is someone who thinks, who gets like super obsessive about certain things, dresses in a really unique way so that she doesn't have to engage in normal social rituals, and like treats conversation like a series of like jokes in order to cope with the fact that she doesn't seem actually very good at saying things directly. And this is her saying, "Don't leave," almost like this opera being made shows that we are meant to leave in a way, and that there is no hope for us, and that maybe she's not centering herself as Madame Butterfly, because that would be a pretty fucked up way to view yourself, even in this kind of context. But clearly there are shades of that, right? And I don't know. It's one of those things where, again, people talk about Pynchon's characters being two-dimensional, and it's just weird because no, I mean, this reading that section as just like, what if it's a reference to a Puccini opera, is like insane. Like you're brain dead if that's how you read that.
It is very easy to get lost in the, oh, look at this reference when you're going into Pynchon's work, especially something like this. But you do the man a disservice by limiting him just to that.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then we are treated to another departure scene. There's been several of these in this book. I regularly think about the scene where the Traverse matriarch like leaves. I think it's, what is it, Denver, that has the railroad tracks that she goes backwards on.
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I regularly think about that scene, but there's been a number of them where these characters part ways, go in their separate directions, move forward, but they leave something behind. Like, that is very much a motif of this book, and it does not escape my notice that the final section of it is French for sort of street of departure or path of departure.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just another really well written version of this that is going to be almost in a way bilocated by the next chapter, in the fact that instead of somebody leaving, they decide to stay somewhere. There's a lot of, I would be very unsurprised if you went down and broke down bilocations as like a chunk, and there was some rhyme or reason to the parallels or opposites that keep happening from chapter to chapter, or character to character. It feels very intentional to me.
Absolutely.
Do we have anything else from chapter 40 before we go into 41?
Not for me.
I guess I wanted to raise a question.
Okay.
Just on 566, there is the mention, or not so much a question in general, but more a pointing to, and maybe questions will be raised. This piece of hardware had turned out to be supremely dangerous, as apt to harm its user as its target. If military intelligence here in Belgium was getting it confused with a Quaternion weapon, mythical or not, then the interest from other powers would be immense indeed. So this is not a Quaternion weapon?
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah. It might be a Quaternion weapon, and Kit might just not be familiar with the hot lingo coming out of the military industry these days.
Yeah.
But it's definitely more than a little ambiguous.
Especially considering that Quaternion weapon is in quotes too.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Pynchon's been doing that a lot this book. Just any
That's
kind of word of art, term of art, I guess. But still.
I did not catch that. That's a smart implication you're pointing out there, Will.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know what that particularly means. Again, unless Cody wants to break the seal.
I don't.
I think he has that firmly quarantined.
Yep.
One, we intend to sing the love of danger, the habit of energy, and fearlessness. 2, courage, audacity, and revolt will be essential elements of our poetry. 3, up to now, literature has exalted a pensive immobility, ecstasy, and sleep. We intend to exalt aggressive action, a feverish insomnia, the racer's stride, the mortal leap, the punch, and the slap. 4, we affirm that the world's magnificence has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed. A racing car whose hood is adorned with great pipes, like serpents of explosive breath. A roaring car that seems to ride on grape shot is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace. 5, we want to hymn the man at the wheel who hurls the lance of his spirit across the earth, along the circle of its orbit. 6, the poet must spend himself with ardor, splendor, and generosity to swell the enthusiastic fervor of the primordial elements. 7, except in struggle there is no more beauty. No work without an aggressive character can be a masterpiece. Poetry must be conceived as a violent attack on unknown forces to reduce and prostrate them before man. 8, we stand on the last promontory of the centuries. Why should we look back when what we want is to break down the mysterious doors of the impossible? Time and space died yesterday. We already live in the absolute because we have created eternal, omnipresent speed. 9, we will glorify war, the world's only hygiene. Militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of freedom bringers, beautiful ideas worth dying for, and scorn for women. 10, we will destroy the museums, libraries, and academies of every kind. We'll fight moralism, feminism, every opportunistic or utilitarian cowardice. We will sing of great crowds excited by work, by pleasure, and by riot. We will sing of the multicolored polyphonic tides of revolution in the modern capitals. We will sing of the vibrant, mighty, and nightly fervor of arsenals and shipyards blazing with violent electric moons, greedy railway stations that devour smoke-plumed serpents, factories hung on clouds by the crooked lines of their smoke, bridges that stride the rivers like giant gymnasts, flashing in sun with a glitter of knives, adventurous streamers that sniff the horizon, deep-chested locomotives whose wheels paw the tracks like hooves of enormous steel horses bridled by tubing, and the sleek flight of planes whose propellers chatter in the wind like banners and seem to cheer like an enthusiastic crowd. It is from Italy that we launch through the world this violently upsetting, incendiary manifesto of ours. With it today, we establish futurism, because we want to free this land from its smelly gangrene of professors, archaeologists, ciceroni, and antiquitarians. For too long has Italy been a dealer in second-hand clothes. We mean to free her from the numberless museums that cover her like so many graveyards. Museums, cemeteries, identical, surely, in the sinister promiscuity of so many bodies unknown to one another. Museums, public dormitories where one lies forever beside hated or unknown beings. Museums, absurd abattoirs of paintings and sculptors ferociously slaughtering each other with color blows and line blows. The length of the fought-over walls that one should make an annual pilgrimage, just as one goes to the graveyard on All Souls' Day, that I grant. that once a year one should leave a floral tribute beneath the Gioconda. I grant you that. But I don't admit that our sorrows, our fragile courage, our morbid restlessness should be given a daily conducted tour through museums. Why poison ourselves? Why rot? And what is there to see in an old picture except the laborious contortions of an artist throwing himself against the barriers that thwart his desire to express his dream completely? Admiring an old picture is the same as pouring our sensibility into a funerary urn instead of hurtling it far off in violent spasms of action and creation. Do you then wish to waste all your best powers in this eternal and futile worship of the past, from which you emerge fatally exhausted, shrunken, and beaten down? In truth, I tell you that daily visits to museums, libraries, and academies, cemeteries of empty exertion, calvaries of crucified dreams, registries of aborted beginnings are, for artists as damaged as the prolonged supervision by parents of certain young people drunk with their talent and their ambitious wills. When the future is barred to them, the admirable past may be a solace for the ills of the moribund, the sickly, the prisoner, but we want no part of it. The past, we the young and strong futurists. So let them come, the gay incendiaries with charred fingers. Here they are. Come on, set fire to the library shelves, turn aside the canals, and flood the museums. Oh, the joy of seeing the glorious old canvases bobbing adrift on those waters, discolored and shredded. Take up your pickaxes, your axes and hammers, and wreck the venerable cities piteously. The oldest of us is 30, so we have at least a decade for finishing our work. When we are 40, other younger and stronger men will probably throw us in the wastebasket like useless manuscripts. We want it to happen. They will come against us, our successors. They'll come from far away, from every quarter, dancing to the winged cadence of their first songs, flexing the hooked claws of predators sniffing dog-like at the academy doors the strong odor of our decaying minds, which will have already been promised to the literary catacombs. But we won't be there. At least they'll find us one winter's night in open country, beneath a sad roof drummed by a monotonous ruin. They'll see us, crouched beside our trembling aeroplanes in the act of warming our hands at the poor little blaze that our books of today will give out when they take fire from the flight of our images. They'll storm around us, panting with scorn and anguish, and all of them, exasperated by our proud daring, will hurtle to kill us, driven by a hatred the more implacable, the more their hearts will be drunk with love and admiration for us. Injustice, strong and sane, will break out radiantly in their eyes. Art, in fact, can be nothing but violence, cruelty, and injustice. The oldest of us is 30. Even so, we have already scattered treasures, 1,000 treasures of force, love, courage, astuteness, and raw willpower, have thrown them impatiently away, with fury, carelessly, unhesitatingly, breathless and unresting. Look at us! We are still untired. Our hearts know no weariness because they are fed with fire, hatred, and speed. Does that amaze you? It should, because you can never remember having lived. Erect on the summit of the world, once again we hurl our defiance at the stars. You have objections. Enough. We know them. We've understood. Our fine, deceitful intelligence tells us that we are the revival and extensions of our ancestors. Perhaps, if only it were so. But who cares? We don't want to understand. Woe to anyone who says those infamous words to us again. Lift up your heads. Erect on the summit of the world, once again we hurl defiance to the stars. That is a selected portion of the Futurist Manifesto, which will come to be particularly important towards the end of this chapter. But when I was trying to figure out what to include, I kept extending out the section of it to read, because at first it was just, okay, the numbered portion, those are like their resolutions. But then further into it, he starts talking about flooding the canals and breaking sort of the streets and watching the kind of masterpieces of the old float away. And that has some very specific resonance to this chapter in Venice and in this kind of changing perspective of Venice that Dally is going to begin to articulate. And the tourist angle of Venice, the kind of real and unreal Venice, and the sort of city of implications almost from different people's perspectives that it represents. And of course, as we'll talk about later, the futurists hated Venice in particular. So it's very clear, at least to me anyway, that the writer of that manifesto, who we'll get to eventually, may have been referring to Venice specifically when he was talking about filling the canals and paving over the streets. Very interesting document from history, but we'll get to that later. We'll get to that later. Chapter 41 opens sort of as the Zombini family is beginning to wrap up things in Venice. But Dally has decided that she wants to stay and that she has really fallen in love with the city. And this is, again, more cases of just how great Pynchon's character writing is expressed over these pages. Because we have not spent very much time with them, but the impact of her desire to leave, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit over the mirror stuff just to kind of round out this one plot line of her choosing to stay, that it is delivered in such a way that the impact, especially from the perspective of her mother, talking about regaining her for a time, only to have to let her go, and that is in essence, if we're talking about parallels, her doing the same thing to her mother that she did to her, that just she had to go, that she had to separate as her destiny was in another place. It's just, again, it's another case of being very simplistically written with not much kind of page time in the book dedicated to, but it still is delivered in a way that is very affecting and very devastating. And is, again, another one of these cases of different avenues or streets of departure, where we have groups of characters leaving one another, going off to different places. And it is an instance where someone is choosing to stay behind instead of go somewhere else. And that feels especially relevant for Dally, given that she has never really been presented up to this point in the book with that option of like, I want to stay here. This is what I want to do. She no longer has to chase after some other ideal or some other sort of parent or goal. She's really beginning to self-actualize as she gets older, which feels very realistic for the type of character that she is. Dally is like probably my favorite character in the book to this point. She doesn't have a lot of time, but every time there's a chapter dedicated to her, she's so great. I love her perspective. I love her decision making up until the very end of this chapter that we're reading, and I love the way in which that she has kind of conducted herself as this survivor, this very adaptive person, and now she just gets to have kind of fun for a while and just be somewhere she wants to be. It feels like a very excellently earned moment for that character, given how Pynchon had written her up to that point.
Couldn't agree more.
But if you recall from earlier in the book, the reason why the Zombinis have come here is because they need to figure out what's going on with this cabinet that they have, which is causing people to essentially separate into two copies or to bilocate, if we're going to borrow the phrase that this portion of the book is named after. And so they go to a person who might be able to help because they made the cabinets. And they explain that there is indeed a differential sort of mirror element within this cabinet that causes this to happen. Before we get into the cabinet itself, they do make a reference to the fact that it is a variation on the classic Maskelyne cabinet of 40 years ago. Another one of the great sort of moments of arguing in the Pynchon Wiki is the fact that they thought this was a reference to the royal astronomer from Mason and Dixon. Even though it's like 200 years later, and there's no way that guy's still alive. Well, maybe a little over 100, not 200, but it's wild. This is in fact actually a reference to John Neville Maskelyne, who was a member of Houdini's magic circle and a traveling magician for over 30 years. He was also heavily invested in debunking spiritists and mediums that were commonly purporting to be performing wonders instead of just tricks.
Yep.
He began his career after seeing a performance by the Davenport brothers, a duo of fraudulent spiritists. He, in response to this, made his own version of their conjuring cabinet along with his friend George Abbott Cook, and they began doing road shows showing off the trick that the Davenports were engaged in. This led to a long career in both stage magic and debunking. For 31 years, he did a residency at the Egyptian Hall in London. The two performers did many tricks, but the cabinet show and levitation were always done. Masculine would also write a book on the methods of cheating at card games. That would be very popular. And then he also invented the pay toilet, just as a random thing that he did. In 1914, he would create the Occult Committee in order to, quote, investigate claims to supernatural power and expose fraud. But he'd already been doing that anyway. His observations at the Cambridge seance sittings in 1895 helped to expose Eusebia Palladino, who is directly referenced earlier in this book with the segment about the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. He testified against Henry Slade in 1876. He wrote a book on his own investigations in 1891, which had become an early text for animalistic psychology. He also, and this is just like a weird interconnection with Basil Zaroff, he debated Hiram Maxim in the Strand magazine on the trickery of the Davenport brothers. And then Maxim would be the person who invented the machine gun that Basil Zaroff would try to sell and be sabotaged repeatedly at his showings of it. Just a weird element of crossover between two of the people that he refers to. The weirdest thing, though, is that the spiritualist Alfred Russel Wallace would not accept that Masculine was just like a traveling magician, and instead tried to claim that he had actual spiritual powers, just like the Davenport brothers, and that was why he was able to reproduce their conjuring, not just because it was fake. Even stranger, that guy was a major inspiration for Charles Darwin.
Mm-hmm.
So, really odd kind of overlaps in some of the historical figures in this section. And again, goes to show how all of this stuff is truly knitted together in a tapestry that Pynchon is putting together.
So I want to add a few things onto here.
Yeah.
John Neville Maskelyne claimed to be related to Neville Maskelyne, but that has never been proven. In fact, most scholars disagree with that and say that he wasn't. He might have been named after him, or he might have changed his name to be named after him, but he doesn't seem to have any actual direct lineage to Maskelyne. Number two, you glossed over an important part of the Pynchon wiki argument, for lack of a better term, in which the first person's wrong that it saying that Maskelyne is named after Neville Maskelyne, which no, he's a real person. The second person, and I just want to read verbatim what they wrote here. While Maskelyne is indeed a real person, the name is very suggestive of mescaline. The two do not seem to be, quote, related.
Oh, yeah!
If you take the period out of that sentence, it becomes true. Maskelyne and mescaline are not related whatsoever. So that person missed an opportunity there. Number three, I wish we still lived in a time where debunking was still like a big thing and was like an event to go to, because I love this era of entertainment, and specifically this your Houdinis and your Maskelynes and all these other people who made it their life's work to debunk what these hucksters were doing. And it wasn't just like, I'm sure part of it was like, I want to upstage them because, they're getting all this attention and I'm not. But the other part of it was, no, they're spreading bullshit, and that's just not cool. Like, we can't let that happen. So let's go and just show everyone how this is done. And it's not something you really see much of anymore for a number of reasons. But like, the few people who were still kind of actively pursuing that just don't get the same level of attention in it. And it kind of sucks, because that was such a cool part of history, that public destroying and dismantling of spiritualism.
Yeah. And then you had other people on the other side of the equation, like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was desperately trying to to prove that fairies were real for
Trying
some
to
reason.
Trying to square a circle in the worst possible ways. Just, oh my God, it was embarrassing.
I don't really have much to add to the stuff on the cabinet itself because Pynchon kind of puts it plainly on the page. He explains
Yeah.
why it's creating the duplicates and then says that like the solution to the issue is to find them and get them to go back into the cabinet again.
Yeah. I mean, really, the important thing in there is that it makes mention of the fact that the doubles aren't really doubles. They're actually the original person slightly displaced in time.
Yeah.
And that goes back to that idea of those sort of convergent worlds that are slightly off kilter from each other. So this is where it starts to kind of explain more of what not just the bilocations theme is, but also what the Iceland spar is capable of in the right circumstances with the right application to it.
Yeah.
It has this ability.
Well, and I would assume Lou Basnight as well.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah, that he's one of these special cases.
Yes.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
would
go
like
ahead.
to hop back to masculine real quick.
Okay.
Just to
You mean
say,
mescaline?
I mean mescaline, yeah.
Thank you.
So essentially, first of all, I think, and this is something I can't find because I forgot his name. I believe masculine was like Harry Houdini's #1 hero. if I remember.
Yes, he was.
Yep.
Yeah. Beyond that, his grandson was the guy I was trying to remember like 4 episodes ago who claimed to invent camouflage in the modern era.
Oh,
yeah.
That's who it was. Yeah.
Cody, I just have to acknowledge how creepy it was that you and I had the exact same response,
Yeah, that was kind of interesting.
both
Yeah.
in words, but then the pause and then a laugh that increased in pitch towards the end.
Yeah.
That was frightening. And I haven't even spent that much time with you in person.
I know.
But yeah, now I'm now starting to wonder if Pynchon didn't initially start writing a book about Tesla or Houdini and then just ended up writing Mason and Dixon in Against the Day.
It really would be interesting to kind of know his starting point for each of the big novels, really for all of them, but for the big three especially. Like,
Yeah.
what was the sort of like the thing that made him go like, I want to write a book about that, and it just spiraled out from there.
Yeah, I mean, Jasper, I highly recommend anyone who was his curiosity was piqued by my mention a few episodes back. Go look up Jasper Masculine.
Oh yeah,
he was a nut job, and he
It's a
was
wild
not good
ride.
at anything. It's an
He's
amazing.
not good at anything.
It's pretty impressive. It's pretty
Well,
crazy.
I mean, you know, if we're gonna get real big brain about it, is it possible that the joke of Neville Maskelyne, the astronomer, wearing wizard robes was meant to be a nod to a stupid costume that would be, you know, patterned in fabric that Jasper would eventually claim to have come up with? Who knows?
I mean, genuinely, yeah. And I mean, what about like the is the masculine cabinet a further punning of the toilet ship? Like really, once you get to that level of galaxy brain, what I think that just dismissing it as not being about our Neville Masculine is a little bit short-sighted. It's Pynchon. He loves his puns.
That's
But
true.
anyway, let's move on because
Definitely
this is just is not relevant.
All right. So, as we already mentioned, Dally informs her mother and Luca Zambini that she will be staying behind Venice, and her mother gets to share some vulnerability with her husband about it, and we do get some nice, sort of not explicit detail, but some implications as to what their relationship might have been like after they ran off, which is nice to see. Just again, another element of Pynchon kind of adding in that extra bit of character work where he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to kind of give us Luca's perspective of their elopement, but he does, and it adds something to the whole nature of this book and these characters and their relationships to one another in a way that's really solid. And from there, we kind of switch perspective just to Dally alone in Venice, and she's fallen in love with the city, and she realizes that she needs to start making some money, and so she begins putting some of the tricks that she's learned from both Luca and her father to good use, sort of blending these two halves of her life in a really great way. And she starts to pick up some scratch. That's the way that I imagine Dally would refer to money.
Yeah. Yeah.
I gotta go earn some scratch. And she begins to start to hate tourists. And this is interesting because this feels very relevant contemporaneously with Jeff Bezos' wedding in Venice from like just a year or two ago, where there was Venetian citizens that were like very upset, not just with Bezos, but with like tourism in general through their city. And that, of course, was coming at the same time that like like native people who were living in Barcelona were shooting, I think, squirt guns at tourists that were coming to the city. This is a whole thing, yeah, during that whole kind of Bezos wedding summer. So this idea of a hatred of tourists seems to be ingrained in people who live in Venice one way or the other. But I think there's also something interesting in this quote at the bottom of 574 where it says, quite soon she had grown to hate tourists and what she saw them doing to Venice, changing it from a real city to a hollow and now and then outright failed impersonation of itself. All the centuries of that irregular seethe of his history reduced to a few simple ideas, and then a seasonal human inundation just able to grasp them. And that really brings to mind, like, not just that that's what tourist traps essentially are, like a weird distillation of the environment that births the tourist trap, and whatever that is, whether it's like a restaurant or a landmark or something, is sort of in and of itself growing out of an industry where that's just something that people used to do, and so the city became identified with it. Like, he describes that really well, but that's also to link this to not just things that were going on in the country during the time that he was writing it, but also to like Bleeding Edge in particular. That is how gentrification happens. That like people notice something about a neighborhood or a place that they visit that, you know, they particularly like, that links that neighborhood to it in their mind. And you can only do that with so many layers until essentially the neighborhood comes to be known by those things. People move in there, copycats of those things come up, and as the area gentrifies, the originals run out of business, and then suddenly the neighborhood has evolved into effectively a parody of itself from where it is now to where it started. But everyone just kind of doesn't acknowledge that it's a parody because they don't know any better. They think it's the genuine article. Like, it's such a simplistic thing that he writes there in terms of how he lays it out, but it is so accurate to a lot of the other things that Pynchon has on his mind, beyond just his character having a problem with tourists in general, in a way that was really impressive to me.
Yeah, like the Pynchon theory of universal Flanderization.
Right. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is almost like genuinely, to make another kind of tongue-in-cheek thing. It is like Pynchon is taking the lesson that we all learned from Sex and the City, that the city's a character, and applying, you know, what we all know well. If you listen to this show, you know, well, you're a character, you have to exemplify yourself. And in this case with Venice, that means I guess, oh, what's that damn song? I just lost the melodies in my head, but that song that the punters sing while they're wearing their striped shirts. In any case, yeah.
And Dally, in order to kind of protect herself in the rough and tumble portions of Venice, is dressing as a boy now so that she can pass unharassed. And this is when she eventually runs into our old friend Hunter Penhallow, who I did not remember was a person. But every time I read this book and something gets reincorporated, I just remember that diagram that Will sent a couple of weeks ago of the Fibonacci sequence and how that might map to how some of this stuff comes in. So he's from very, very early in the book, if you're reading along with us. He is part of the Vormance expedition.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the whole stuff with the Destroyer, that occurs as a result of the Four Man's expedition, he is whisked away to what he describes as a future safety in the moment on something that appears to be a train or at the very least a vehicle of some kind, but that it turns out, at least from his perspective, was not peace or safety. It was something else entirely. And now he's back somehow. He's shown up in Venice. I would like to ask you guys what, in a broad sense, because this all kind of unfolds over a couple of different pages and a couple of different quotes, but what do we think Hunter Penhall's deal is? What happened to him? Why is he back in a contemporaneous period with where he started? And what is his fear?
Sorry, go ahead, Will.
I guess I was just gonna say it's very funny to me that you didn't remember him, because I remember reading this opening section, to prepare for the show, and just thinking, well, this is interesting. This is like an inversion of exactly what Hunter Penhall went through in the beginning of his chapter. And yeah, the way I take it is that like Hunter is this guy who seems to have inhabited some kind of pocket dimension, right? Maybe that parallel dimension that we were talking about last chapter, maybe the other parallel dimension where the time thieves are coming from. Who knows exactly where? But he's raised by his grandmother, right? Or is it just his mother, Constance? And it's like this inversion of Venice, and then Hunter wants to see the world, and it seems like this inversion of Venice is like somehow located near Reykjavik, I guess, if I'm remembering correctly. And he ends up on the Vormans expedition as just a deckhand, essentially, as an assistant on the voyage. And he then sees New York City be engulfed with flames brought onto them by science. And he sees the vision of a demonic version of Jesus say, "Worship me." And I think you totally can read the in like all of Pynchon's stuff, but especially this book. I think you can read him absconding on that, what is kind of framed as a time machine in this chapter, as literal, or you can read it as him like having been in like essentially a parochial kind of mindset, and then wanting to see the world, and then having his just sense of reality broken to the point where all he can do is flee to this thing that he knows is like what he knows, but is as far away as possible. Going away from whatever weird pocket dimension version of Reykjavik looks like Venice, all the way to the proper Venice. And he's just gonna do painting now. Thank you very much. He's seen what science does. He's seen what exploration does. He might have some wanderlust, and he might still not want to like settle down yet, because he's an artist. He's a Byronic hero of a self-styling, and that man doesn't settle down in Venice. But Hunter, I don't know, I just can't imagine someone like Hunter who's like 17 or 18 when we first meet him, and within a year he witnesses maybe the most horrific thing you can imagine.
The biblical terror.
Yeah, legit. Yeah, I get him choosing to just paint in Venice.
Yeah. Yeah, I instantly loved this character after this chapter, for sure.
Yeah.
And he does, and I think part of what I loved about him so much is basically that mindset that you're articulating. I don't think I would have made that connection on my own in terms of how to verbalize it, but he does just give this kind of like, doesn't bother me none. The world's gonna keep going. I'm just gonna focus on my one little thing. I'm just gonna paint in Venice and be okay with that. Even down to like what he is painting in and of itself, just these simple like streets or alleyways or corners of the city that in his mind are representative of the entire city. What I do find interesting, and that I think does link in with what you're talking about, Will, with just a little bit of light interpretive work, is the fact that when he looks at the futurist's painting at the end, and I know that he doesn't say that he's a futurist, that he is instead sympathetic to the futurists, but is doing pointillism. I'm going to refer to him as the futurist for the rest of this chapter, just for the so you can get over it. When he looks at the futurist's painting at the end of the chapter, he sees the vehicle in it that he is painting, and within that, he is reminded of the vehicle that he took towards whatever hellscape he visited. And I think that's interesting from an interpretive element because it seems clear to me that Pynchon, if you're doing the research, is linking that vehicle to this like slide towards fascism. Because not to presage the stuff that I have to share, futurism and fascism were very closely linked together. And that somehow all of that terror that he witnessed and all of that sort of hellacious sort of time is related to that slide into fascism. And of course, like fascism is in a certain way the kind of like logical end conclusion of militarization and capital intermixing with one another. But I don't know. I don't think I'm off base on that, but I was curious what you guys thought in relation to his reference there at the end as well, and didn't want to necessarily wait to go through all this material to get to it. Cody, do you have any thoughts?
I do, and they've actually changed in the time that you guys have been talking.
Okay.
So, well, I shouldn't say changed. I think they kind of solidified. What I think I'm starting to get at in this reading is that Hunter Penhollow and Hoover are two people who have experienced the same thing but came out of it differently. What that thing is, I think, is I'm trying to this is all like I hadn't thought all this out to a point where I can articulate it well, so bear with me while I just try to like brain dump this.
Conspiracy corner.
Conspiracy corner.
Электромузыкальный инструмент терминвокс – это первый инструмент такого типа.
Okay. Both of these people have been in some sort of inverted or parallel time to our own, or to the one that exists within the book, right? The main narrative of the book. Both of them witnessed something horrific there that has caused a sort of schism in their mind, but one is taking it to an extreme paranoid obsessiveness. That would be Hoover. The other is taking it towards a, if I don't see it, it can't happen kind of situation, and that's Hunter. So I think they both somehow were not transported, whatever you want to say is the right word. Bilocated, I guess, is the better word. They were both bilocated, right, to this inversion of the world as is normally presented within the book. Both of them witness a terror that they are trying to essentially tell people now to stop. That could be World War I, that could be World War II. I think it's either one of those, if not both. They are both trying to express this horror and the means by which it can be stopped, but are not able to do so because of the horror being so incomprehensible. In Hoover's situation, I think he's connected that with the chums, and he thinks that seeing them is a portent of what is to come, and that's what causes him to just completely lose his shit when he's chasing Kid around. With Penhollow, I think this whole talk of like hell and the inverted version of Venice and the New York on fire and all that, I think that's him trying to say, like, I saw what the world became as a result of this path it's on. Nothing good comes of it. But the way in which both of them kind of approached that, I think it had the same effect, but in a cracked prism of a way, if that makes sense. Like, they both are operating on the same crystal, but there's a schism in that crystal that they're both on opposite sides of. So they've got the same experience, but they've got different reactions to it as a result. I don't know if any of that made any sense, but that's kind of where my brain's been going.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying makes sense. I don't know if I buy they're necessarily doubles of each other, but they're definitely.
Oh, I don't think they're doubles of each other. I think they're both doubles. Yeah. Just
okay, yeah.
They've experienced the same thing and are reacting differently towards it.
I see. Yeah. I guess I don't know if I get such. It's less of a head in the sand thing with Hunter, and more of a shrug, hands up.
Yeah, I guess more of like, well, it's whatever. It's gonna happen. What are you gonna do?
All-consuming fire will come whether I want it or not.
Yeah, might as well make the most of my time while I'm here.
Definitely, though, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, and it does bring up another parallel that came to mind too of Dally and Lake, where both of them sort of like have unconventional relationships with their family. Both of them have different perspectives, certainly on like prostitution or engaging in sex work. Both of them have to find a way to kind of make money for themselves, and then finally both of them end well. I don't know that the futurist is a bad guy, and I don't know that Dally's gonna end up with him, but both of them are ultimately kind of seduced away by power in a certain way, or potential representatives of power. So there are other parallels between characters that are not like one-to-one or bilocated versions of each other, but they are going in similar directions on a similar path, or in opposite or similar directions on a similar path, in a really interesting way to consider as well.
Yeah, especially since like Lake is someone who spent her childhood and young adulthood dreaming of being independent and self-driven, and that's just the opposite for Dally. She's
Yeah,
a person who really wanted to have the atomic family unit.
yeah, and they
This
go
makes
in
me
the
want to.
opposite directions.
I just want to map out all the characters now and start to see if I can put together who's the sort of like the doppelgangers of each other.
Yeah,
I'm sure there's something there.
who's
But
the
with
doppelganger for Professor Vanderjuice?
ooh, I don't know. That's the problem with a book that has this many characters. I think about that and I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't have that kind of time.
Yeah, I mean, this shouldn't go in the final show, but I've done like preliminary sketchings of like the software architecture for being able to do that with books, of like loading in a text and loading in like tags, and to do diagrams like that, kind of not automatically but more like the equivalent of like charting things, right? And
Mhm.
the longer I spent doing that, I was like, oh shit, this is what Palantir does. This is the same thing Palantir
Wow.
does.
Wow.
It's just, yeah, yeah. But I agree, like when it comes to fiction, I don't see anything wrong with it. But yeah, it was one of those very harrowing moments where like, Jesus fucking Christ, tension. Why do you write books that like prove your own theses so well, so
Yeah.
deeply well?
So true. Well, Cody, when I start working on the companion, I guess I'll let you know if more things
Yeah, please do.
come up in connection with one another. All right. So from there, the two of them get to talking. Hunter and Dally sort of hit it off pretty early, and it turns out that Dally kind of becomes his muse in a way, and they form this really just nice relationship. And it's nice to have a relationship that doesn't have like a preeminently evil sexual undertone to it. Like so
Yeah.
often
Yeah.
when a woman makes friends with a man in Pynchon's books, it is you screaming at the page the entire time. Stop! Stop what you're doing. But that's not the case. Hunter's just interested in her from an artistic perspective and helping his own work.
For now.
For now, anyway. Maybe that'll change. Maybe he'll turn into a total douchebag later on.
He's such a Chad later in the book.
He starts doing jaw exercises after he gets totally mogged by the futurist at the end of this chapter. Oh, we lost Cody. R.I.P.
Just on like another level of that, what that appreciation. I love that it's such a weirdly. It's one of those things that it didn't need to be done, and it's many people would criticize Pynchon for this, but like the absurdly specific financial arrangement that they have set up is
Yeah.
another one of those things where like, yeah, this is this is like two people inhabiting three roles that are traditionally interexploitative of one another. And instead it's just two people who have just agreed that they're going to cut the like Gordian knot, and they're just both going to inhabit this like exploitative role. And it's
Yes.
cool from that standpoint, because
Yeah.
it is, yeah, it's like the way that, like Luke mentioned prominently early on in the talk of the book, and there through the lack of like moral lines being clarified, or the idea of identity becoming something that is more essentialized, I guess,
Yeah.
is really like brought into the economic realm in that, in a very simple way, because normally it's like weird theory fiction approaches when Pynchon gets at economics. But no, there he's just like, here is a one-on-one economic arrangement that does not that does avoid exploiting people, which is nice.
Absolutely. As they work together, we get another reference to this like looming threat of war coming down the pike in history. To Cody's point, there is not a distinction between whether it's World War I or World War II. Just something, a war in Europe. There's been plenty of those over the course of history.
Been a couple.
There's been a few, yeah. And this is where we get more referential material to him being a time traveler, or he's almost in certain ways described similarly to the Intruders are, where he's kind of floating around in a space that he maybe doesn't belong in. But I don't really have anything else to add to that outside of what we already did.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm working on a theory here that I think it's pretty obvious that Hunter is one of the displaced people that was mentioned earlier. And I think I mentioned this earlier in an earlier episode, but I think this might be like these displaced people are sort of a proto Thanatoid. I don't know. I have to develop that theory some more, but that's kind of where I'm going with Hunter and his ilk.
Yeah. Well, and I think that on 578 we have a really great quote here that speaks to Will's interpretation or his understanding of kind of Hunter's perspective. Does someone want to read the quote that starts with "She wondered if this war" at the end of the paragraph?
She wondered if this war of his was responsible in some way for removing bodily passion from his life. How long was he fixing to stay in Venice? When the Bora blew down from the mountains announcing the winter, would he ride it on out of town? Would she, in September when the Vino Forte arrived from Brindisi, Scinsano, and Barletta, would he be gone in a couple of weeks as well?
So there's this element of his character that's almost got this resigned nature in it, of just to Will's reading of him, that I agree wholeheartedly with that idea of like, I've seen the worst things that I can possibly see. I'm just gonna paint my paintings. I'm just going to kind of go about my life in as simple of a way as I can. And it's one of those cases where, again, like, none of this stuff, if we're doing our jobs well enough, make a lot of this stuff more obvious to the reader if they're listening to us while reading or in tandem. I would not recommend listening to us while trying to read the pages. So we, if we're doing our job correctly, make a lot of this stuff very clear. But the work that Pynchon is doing is subtle for a writer, and he works a lot with implied meaning or implication by what he's telling you about a character, as opposed to just telling you these interpretations that, in this case, Will provides, or that any of us might provide about something. And it again just goes to show not just the great character writing, but more of an illustration of just his abilities as a writer in general. They are just superlative amongst all of the many good writers that I have read in my life. So then it gets into my next portion here that I have like a question for you guys on. The whole ghosts in Venice and the discourse on the infancy gospel of Thomas. One of the best things I've ever read. Like, not even necessarily just from the whole implications with how the Gospel of Thomas piece interacts with Pynchon's interest in entropy and all of the work that is doing within the book and this sort of making chaos out of order element of these stories. But the framing, if you just look at it from like a craft perspective, the framing of this is like Dally being talked to in Venice in a museum by Hunter, remembering a time when she was a child in America and being told a story by her father that switches into the perspective of her father telling her the story
Yeah.
as she's in it. Like the levels of framing of that narrative work are just on a purely craft perspective, as another writer who is not nearly as good as Pynchon is, so incredible and so impressive. But I just absolutely loved this segment of the book. The ghosts in Venice, the flashback to her childhood. I have the entirety of page 581 highlighted. I have most of 580 highlighted. I have most of 579 highlighted. And I have most of, let's see here, 582, the entirety of 583 also highlighted.
Yeah, those are pretty much the same pages that have most of my notes as well.
So I want to start there with the infancy gospel stuff. What is our impression? What do we think is going on?
So I'll at a surface level, and I think if Will is our mathematics expert on the show, I think you're obviously the religion expert because you're the only one who's actually ordained at any point.
Sure.
I think it's showing the duality that existed in a figure such as Christ. This sort of like balance of whether you want to call it mischief, because I think from my limited understanding of the Gospel of Thomas, it's not so much about a matter of Jesus being just like kind of mischievous. Like he was doing some pretty wicked shit at the time too, for a kid. I think he brought one of his friends back from the dead or something and was like killing people who disagreed with him. I could be wrong on that. That's just my recollection of it, but I seem to remember there being some darker stuff in there than what gets mentioned in this retelling that Merle does. But I think it's highlighting this sort of back and forth and the duality of good and evil that exists in everyone, but using Jesus as a sort of like exemplary example of man, right? Like, especially in this era of time where Christianity is the dominant, or at least becoming the dominant religion. He would be the sort of like go-to example of this kind of duality. And it's interesting even more so because this is a section of the Bible that for the most part, the church has tried to kind of erase and not really want to discuss. So that's, I think, on the most surface level reading of it, I think that's kind of the takeaway that I'm getting from it. But I was going to ask what you had taken from it, just given your background on the subject.
Well, it's not a real story from the Gospel of Thomas. Technically, the Pynchon Wiki is correct also in that like there's no separate infancy Gospel of Thomas.
Right.
So the question for me is like, what is Pynchon trying to say, right? Because like you can refer to any number of things as a parable, but like choosing the term parable and also like the specific nature of the parables of Jesus sort of means something. And usually when you get down to like an analysis of the parables of Jesus, it has much less to do with like Jesus's figure as a person, which is the only reason why I might quibble with you in terms of why it's there, and more to do with some sort of deeper philosophical meaning of like what is happening in the story in and of itself. Like, yes, Jesus was being like a little bit of a hellraiser, and it's funny from a purely sort of humor level to consider him that rather than this kind of pious, almost angelic child that often we look at his childhood now, or at least Mel Gibson does anyway. But those parables are more about the action that is being performed. And I think the Pynchon Wiki is pretty accurate in trying to break down what is happening there. It is making an order out of chaos, or is making something that should be scattered and broken and ruined whole again. And I think that whatever is being commented on within there is effectively what they're talking about within the pinch on wiki. Sorry, I'm losing my track of thought, but like I think that what is being commented on with its inclusion is related more to that sorting perspective. And the pinch on wiki makes a case for, and I tend to agree, that a hunter is trying to effectively make sense out of his environment. And he's making sense out of his environment by painting, or maybe not making sense, but like depicting or tapping into his environment and its history by painting just like one very specific corner of it or street of it or alleyway or whatever the case may be. And that in his perspective, as he articulates to Daly, that one corner or alleyway has like always been there all throughout time, old Venice, current Venice, future Venice. Like, and as a result, this corner or this little piece represents effectively the whole. And that can very much be taken as a illustration of what artists at the time and still to this day kind of try to do, of taking all of their surroundings, their movement, the philosophy behind why they're painting, and the cultural milieu that it comes out of, and how that relates to the greater world around them. All of that is boiled down into a canvas or one creation of something. It is making order out of like the chaos of their surroundings. And that, to blow this up to a larger perspective within the book, that is effectively what you were trying to do with everything at this time. Scientists with the emerging sort of ideas around quantum theory that were only a little bit away. Inventors, both in warfare and out, painters trying to synthesize the moment into these canvases. That all of this is trying to place some sort of order out of that chaos, or to at least put words and pictorial imagery to what is a representation of something, which that in and of itself is many component parts. And that in a lot of cases you can still see those component parts around you, which gets into the whole ghosts thing, if you're attuned to them. And that these, in this case, artists, but I would assume it would apply to a lot of other industries or sort of disciplines in this book, can kind of tap into those artists, or they're being influenced by those prior ideas or prior sort of component parts as they try to simplify something down. But that, you know, is ultimately, if you were to extrapolate it out to its like most logical conclusion, ultimately also kind of limiting. There's also something else in there about it being effectively a comment on like divisionism in painting, but that's more from just like a specific art at this time thing. But for me, that's what it gets down to, is this making order out of chaos, and how that is something that illustratively can try and fight against the tide of entropy, but ends up pushing it forward, because as you narrow these things down, capital gets funneled into the military industrial complex, for example. It actually creates more empathy or more entropy as the result. But I think that the Jesus narrative is a depiction of that sorting process, or taking many components to create one component.
That makes a lot more sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's another like layer to it, I guess I'd mention, of just like there's this to connect back to your mention of the way that artists were viewing art at the time. One of the major things that has only recently started to die off as like a preoccupation of artists is the sublime as this ideal of like there being a thing that is, you know, many times, I'd say most often, approached as though it's some feature of God, or it's like Christ consciousness or something, that allows you to make art. That genius is when you see with Christ consciousness and you transcribe what you see into the material realm. And it's almost, I think almost like Hunter's trying to do the opposite of that, kind of like parse the world away into categories so that we can say that they are made of these components, and more of him like almost like a Zen kind of thing of you he's already been exposed to the worst of it all. So he's just trying to get so hyper normalized that when he paints a mouse eating a piece of cheese in a corner, it represents all of Venice because of the transcendence of his view, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. Yep. Makes sense.
But as far as the like what the as Merle frames it a parable goes, I think you're pretty much on the dot. And it is interesting the way that it is framed. It is framed such that I think there's an argument that we don't know what the hell Hunter is talking about at all. Because we have that specific jump into Merle's description, I think you can choose to read that as like beyond her, she guessed. She was trying to keep up, but Hunter didn't make it easy. One day he told her a story she had actually already heard. And so you can read that quoting of Merle's version of the story as not just, some color, but instead her not being able to connect with the currently told version of the story, and instead bringing in her past experience and
Sure.
overlaying that.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Otherwise, you discredit yourself a little bit, Cody. I think you were getting at something pretty important.
So from there, we're just treated to really great prose that I feel like we can't really do justice without just reading out 2 pages of just straight quotations from the book. But this whole sort of idea of American light and what he might make of that is really, really beautiful writing. Do either of you have something that you want to specifically say on that?
Yeah, so the American Light thing, this drove me crazy earlier today. I think I mentioned it to you. There is a part in Infinite Jest where, and I'm almost positive it's in a discussion between Steepley and Morath, where there's a mention of how everyone on Earth, we all share the same sun, but our location on the globe itself makes us perceive it differently. And that's what I immediately thought of. And I spent way more time than I probably needed to trying to actually find that quote in there. But I couldn't. So it's in there somewhere. But that was the main thing that I thought about, that was this idea that it is our, not so much, I mean, geographical, sure, but also like our cultural ideology and where we land culturally, like where we are culturally. Like, I think that paints the way that we see the world. And so there is that sort of like the American light is sort of the way that, like we were talking about earlier, the way that Americans see a certain thing, whether it's art or a part of nature or a person or whatever the case may be. I think that so much of that, of your cultural identity, shapes how and why you define things a certain way.
I think that makes sense. I also I took it as slightly more of a almost like an ironic passage, the specifically American light part, where Hunter is talking about the light of a certain hour in a certain city. And Dali is trying to think about like the most general form of this idea. And it's almost like it's you could read into it something about the American identity and how like this notion of there being a single American light is this foolish idea. You could also read it as like, well, she's traveling. This is the American light. The American light is this like what we've identified as chiefly Midwestern kind of mode in the U.S. culture, where like road trips are normal. there's just wide swaths of open space that are periodically segmented with fencing. There are long roads that you just travel on forever, and that's like that's the thing that she can pull out of her own cultural memory, perhaps.
Certainly, I think also dealing with the fact that she's been away from home long enough now that there's probably part of her also wondering like
Mm.
what is American light to her at this point, and how would that be depicted? That if you were to show it to an artist, would his interpretation somehow sort of match what I understand as well? Which I think relates back to Kit and Umaki having their moment of realization of just like what even is home to us at this point.
Yeah.
Mhm.
We then learn that Dally is sort of effectively needing to bat away pimps every single night is really the way that this reads. That just she keeps getting offers, she keeps getting these men approaching her trying to get her to enter the sex trade in Venice, and things are getting a little hairy, is I guess the way that I would put it. And eventually, this leads Dally to ask Hunter for some help in finding a place to stay, essentially. And of course, I'm glossing over a bunch of just really well-written paragraphs, just like one after the other here. But hopefully you have read that before listening to this episode, or about to after listening. And Hunter is able to provide her with a spot to live. And after she's been there for a little while, she is visited by Bria Zombini, and they have this great kind of coming back together moment where it shows that Dally, in like a very real way, even though she is separate from her siblings and from her family, that she is still very much a part of it. And so that kind of element that was missing from her life, I think, is really expressed as finally having been found by the fact that one of the members of the family, who's not her mother, is coming to visit her. And it's just like a very nice sequence. Just it's really nice. Like I really
is
like
nice.
it. Yeah. As someone who doesn't really have relationships with siblings like that, even though I wish I did, it's nice to see. And then finally, that is where we're introduced to the futurist. His name is Andrea Tancredi, and this is someone that Hunter is already familiar with, having, quote, run into him around town at the fringes of anarchist gatherings, in cafes, at exhibitions of experimental painting. After having been to Paris and seen the works of Seurat and Signac, Tancredi was converted to divisionism. He sympathized with Marinetti and those around him who were beginning to describe themselves as futurists, but failed to share their attraction to the varieties of American brutalism. Americans, in fact, seemed to greatly annoy him, particularly the millionaires lately dedicated to coming over and looting Italian art. Dally decided not to mention where she was from. And this is where, we're rounding out the chapter. Things are going great. I'm like, hey, I'm almost done. And then I read that paragraph and I go, fuck off. I have hours more work to do now. Because I was familiar with the futurists and the fact that they were related to Italian fascism, but I was not fully aware of all of the information that I am about to share with you. But it is also important to note that there is another disagreement in the Pinchon Wiki for Against the Day that people are saying, I think it's pretty hard to put together like a pretty concrete timeline for Against the Day. I don't think it is. It's 1909 currently. That's when the Futurist Manifesto was published. There was stuff in the previous chapter that was related to like published mathematical or scholarly work that was published in 1908. There's a motorcycle that Frank runs into in his last chapter that wasn't out until 1907. It's not that hard. I'm sorry,
No.
it's not.
There are a lot of pretty much any time like a paper or mathematical paper or a theorem is mentioned, that's Penchon's way of dating this specific moment in the text.
It's like the semi-professional basketball games and Inherent Vice to tell you there's a missing day.
Well, I feel like it's just a symptom of people like getting high off the fact that you can pinpoint the hour that the opening of Gravity's Rainbow takes place,
Sure.
and
Yeah,
they
that's
just
fair.
run with it. It's
Yeah.
like, why can't you do this to everything?
Yeah.
Yep. Read. So here's my all of my historical digest on the futurists. The quote deals with two people or references: the social movement of Italian futurism and its founder Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. Marinetti was born in the British Khedivate of Egypt. We've talked extensively about that in a prior segment of Against the Day, and was educated at both the Sorbonne and the University of Pavia. In 1909, he wrote the Futurist Manifesto, which you've already heard a portion of if you've made it to this sort of point in the podcast. And he published it on the front page of the newspaper Le Figaro. He declared that art, in fact, can be nothing but violence, cruelty, and injustice. It is believed that the manifesto was inspired by a car crash he was a part of in 1908 and a subsequent desire to see an end to the decadence of the prevalent Art Nouveau Liberty style in Italy. That these two things just came to a head, and out of that came his manifesto. He can also be quoted as saying, "Destroy the museums, the libraries, every type of academy, and we will glorify war, the world's only hygiene, militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of freedom bringers, beautiful ideas worth dying for, and scorn for women." By 1910, he had managed to gain allies in his movement with at least 3 young painters and a number of poets. He would publish a second manifesto entitled Against Past-Loving Venice, in which he advocates for the filling of the canals with rubble to make way for a new industrialized and militarized city, one that would dominate the Adriatic. He loved London, big fan of London. He would work as a war correspondent during the Italo-Turkish War in 1911 and the First Balkan War in 1912. He would attempt to spread futurism to England, but he would ultimately fail. It would have a couple of offshoot artistic movements, but English futurism never really took off. The only other place that it really took off in was actually Russia. But he would influence at least one reference to his name in a canto by Ezra Pound, and James Joyce came in contact with the ideas, and of course some of that would influence some of his writing from Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses. He advocated for Italy to enter World War I and actually volunteered for service in the war. He fought in active combat for a while, and then he dropped out because his unit was disbanded after particularly heavy losses in a battle that he was a part of. And for a while, he just did radio and poetry and newspaper articles to try and kind of drum up support for the war in a very propagandistic way. And then he would enter back into service active duty in 1917. And then he was seriously wounded in 1917, took like almost a year to recover from his injury. And then he went right back to it in 1918. So you can't say that he wasn't dedicated to his own belief system. In fact, most of the futurists would volunteer for service in World War I, and a lot of them would die in service. In 1918, he founded the Futurist Political Party, which only a year later would merge with the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, or the Italian Fascist Party started by Benito Mussolini. In 1919, he would then co-author the Fascist Manifesto, which was the first major release by the the Fascist Party in Italy. And he would be a pretty key figure in the party for the next year or so, but then he would walk out in 1920 in disgust over the Fascist Party's dedication to preserving the institutions of Italy, and in particular, looking to glorify its past. And this is where futurism and fascism really begin to separate. So part of the reason I read out as much of that manifesto as I did was, of course, the fact that it relates to Venice, but also within the fact that you can listen to that and you can hear pure fascism in what the guys are articulating that their goal is. This like love of the military, this love of speed, of industrialization. But so it's not hard to see where the alliance would come from. But of course, the point of divergence is fascism requires the kind of central figure to call back to a glorious past, or to model themselves as the only person who's capable of returning you to your sort of glorious past, to your peak. With no particular inference intended, a phrase like "Make America Great Again," centralizing around one particular figure, is a good example of this glorification of the past. And how that one phrase kind of means a lot, or the endorsement or words of the person whose slogan that is means a lot or can accomplish a lot. And so as a result, the futurists are at odds with the fascists, and they begin to kind of fight with one another. And he effectively was never able to recover from that, especially as the futurist movement began to get sidelined by fascism. Everything that Martinetti tried to do really failed. Like he had really effectively sold out his own artistic movement to this greater kind of evil that was swallowing everything in its orbit. He would try to make futurism the official state art of Italy. Mussolini would deny that. He wasn't interested. He would try to look for some degree of overlap between the fascist administration's policies on modern art and his own personal perspectives on modern art to enshrine some of these sort of movements or these artists that he thought were particularly talented. That really wouldn't work for him. He would try to protect the institutions of art after the Italian state began attacking any modern art due to a perceived connection to Jewishness, but he failed there too. All the modern artists were expelled, and their works were, in a lot of cases, destroyed or removed from public viewing. He tried defending futurism in the Futurist newspaper after that happened by saying, like, you know, we're different. We don't believe in what the modern artists believe. We're all about advancing Italy, as a way to kind of like try to head off criticism. And in response to that, the fascist administration shut down his newspaper. He began trying to tamp down his radical beliefs and his avant-garde sensibilities in an effort to rejoin the party, seeing that his influence and his movement that he had given birth to was shrinking and dying. But that would fail too. They wouldn't give him any access back to the party politics at that point. Despite his hatred of academies, which I read out loud to you in the manifesto, he would enter one because he suddenly felt that futurism should be part of the academy and represented there. He was an atheist, but he started converting to Catholicism by the time that he died. He would seek to make futurism have like a return back to its glory days of prior to the fascist party coming into power, and any attempt at that really, really failed or was very, very marginalized. Essentially, his own principles were destroyed by their most logical conclusion in Mussolini's fascist party. And all of the things that you hear me say in this very vindicated voice when I read out that manifesto slowly had holes poked in it over the course of his life after Mussolini comes to power. He slowly acquiesces on every single one of those points as the ultimate sort of vision of what he wanted to create comes to power and coalesces around this one figure who just happens to not be him. And eventually, when World War II comes around and when the Italo-Abyssinian War come around, he enlists in both of those. He is serving in the military into his 60s. And he eventually retires in 1942, and he dies of a heart attack 2 years later, having served his country, gotten nothing out of it, and had his own movement destroyed by itself in an Ouroboros fashion. His movement, however, was bigger than him. He was sort of the center of it, but it involved a lot of painters. And this is where, like, I hate that their paintings are so interesting
Yeah.
because of what they represent. But I would highly recommend that if you have any interest in this period of art, particularly in terms of cubism or divisionism or impressionism or any of the stuff happening in and around the first 20 years of the 19th century, you've got to look at some futurist paintings if you haven't already, because they are really, a lot of them are really excellent and really, really fascinating. But the sort of underpinning philosophy of all of them are pretty reprehensible. The movement, or the members of the movement, would have said that it aims to liberate Italy from the weight of its past. This artistic movement, especially in what it represented on the canvas, would go on to influence a lot of later art styles, including Art Deco, Constructivism, Surrealism, and particularly Dada. The Futurists loved, as I've mentioned a couple times, speed, technology, youth, violence, cars, aeroplanes. They would effectively worship the technological triumph of humanity over nature, glorifying modernity and repudiating the cult of the past and all of its imitations. Their paintings were inspired by divisionism and cubism, but they eschewed a lot of the traditional subject matter, preferring to paint city scenes, objects in motion, and vehicles, and seeking instead to pictorialize dynamism and the relationship between objects and their environment. There's some really interesting paintings that showcase like cities exploding out of somebody's house, or there's one painting where it's like the city enters the home or something like that, where it's a city street leading up to like the front porch of someone's house, all presented in this very abstract, very, very interesting design. They actually remained largely apolitical until 1913, and that was when Marinetti published a specifically political manifesto. And what I mean by that is, like, yes, violence and all of the stuff they're talking about in the manifesto that I read is political, but this later manifesto was literally articulating a fear of the re-election of the Italian prime minister at the time. And at this point, the group began demonstrating against Austria-Hungary in a political manner. And then, of course, when World War II begins, most of them enlist. So while they were saying political things, they were not actively doing politics until about 1913. The Great War effectively covered up the death of this movement. So just the level of destruction of World War I just kind of covers over the silent disintegration of the Futurists, not unlike the 30 Years' War sort of covering up the destruction of the Hanseatic League in the previous chapter. A lot of groups acknowledged that they were going to be, a lot of these individual sort of enclaves acknowledged that they were going to be leaving the movement. A lot of them became Cubists after World War I. A lot of them died in World War I. Several of them would be a part of this artistic movement called, I believe, Return to Normalcy or Return to Reason, which would stop doing the abstract work of the early 1900s and return back more to like Renaissance style paintings or paintings of just like literal figures, not unlike what happened with modernism in literature and the sort of growth of realism out of that. And so as a result, it just kind of faltered. As such, Marinetti would turn to propaganda, politics, and more of that detail, and that's kind of when fascism starts to grow and merge with it. And it's really fitting in a Pinchonian sense that the artistic movement that births fascism should be so preoccupied with the domination of the planet Earth in a mechanized way. Like everything that the Futurists believed in and represent is like truly a antithesis to Pynchon's whole deal. And so it's interesting that they should be mentioned here, not just because like it is a relevant historical reference to the time frame and to Pynchon's clear desire to chart the major evolutions politically and militarily between the wars. That influences so much of his work and the forces and counterforces, the stuff we talk about all the time. But it's also this idea of this silent evil slowly growing out of the time period itself, that is explicitly tied to mechanization and urbanization. and the building of the modern society, the subjugation of the planet Earth, like the futurists themselves said that they wanted to do. That you cannot inherently do that. You cannot inherently praise that without inherently leading to the creation of something like the Italian Fascist Party, which finds its logical conclusion in Hitler and World War II and the mass death and destruction that that represents. It is just such a perfect element to include for this book because it's a historical reference and it's something that works perfectly thematically for what he's doing. And it's interesting that this painter has been influenced by them, but has eschewed calling himself one of them. But yeah, that's the information on that. I wanted to ask your guys' impression of him in that idea of the fact that he is painting in almost an explicitly futurist style, especially if you've looked at some of the futurist paintings, but he himself claims to be just sort of to the side of it or sympathetic to it, but not a part of it. What do you guys make of that status that he had?
I mean, isn't that always kind of how that starts? It's like I don't agree with it, but I'm not disagreeing with it. You know what I mean? Like I think he's kind of a good example of that, of how easy it is to slip into that. And when you blow that out onto a much larger scale, you can look at, like America or Germany and how easy it is for a whole country to just slip that easily into it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I mean, it's almost identical. Now, I can't imagine this is you know, an unfamiliar experience to people who read Thomas Pynchon and listen to an extended discussion of his works. But if you've ever spent time around some of the like burgeoning fascist spaces on the internet of the last 20 years, maybe 15, 20 years, this is how they talk. This this attitude is just what fascists sound like and talk like. And I would like to bring up a historical kind of not counterpoint. He's definitely not a counterpoint, but there was a man, a contemporary to Marinetti and these other more direct futurists, was Gabriele D'Annunzio, who ran essentially a principality out of Fiume, which we now called Rijeka, I think that's pronounced in Slovenian.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's Rijeka. Anyway, and D'Annunzio is a fascist. He's seen as like the John the Baptist to Mussolini's Jesus of fascism.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. He I mean, basically everything that Mussolini ever like got credit for, D'Annunzio wrote it down first and was just more like coherent about. But in any case, D'Annunzio sounds like this. D'Annunzio's political stuff sounds exactly like this. Of like, no, I'm all for fascism. Fascism's very important, but the Nazis take it a little bit too far, which is what D'Annunzio went on to do later in his life. Was basically trying to be the moderating end of the fascist party, which is so bizarre. But yeah, it's this weird attitude that like essentially so much of like this futurist movement and so much of fascist movements today are built on like this intentional closing of your eyes. And it's this kind of thing that like to some extent you can't escape it. You're always going to have to choose to center something in your analysis. You're always going to have to choose to give food to one person and not give it to another. Either way, both of them are going to starve, hypothetically, right? But this strand of thought, this what the futurists gave birth to, that Tancredi so perfectly captures, is this attitude of like, it's whatever I say goes. I don't have to take into consideration these other points of view. They are dismissible because I know better. While still playing the game of like, well, all of those things are valid. All the point of view is reasonable. I don't know. It for me, it's such a gut level response of like, no, this is just how fascists talk. This is what they do. This is how they
Yeah.
use their language. This is how they use their ideas.
Yeah, I think it's evolved a little bit since then, but that's you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I have no doubt that it's, this is an individual who would probably go on to just be a fascist if we
Yeah.
followed him for long enough.
Well, and I just wanted to give a little bit of historical context. Like you mentioned Joyce, and it's not a significant connection, but one of the people who was instrumental in Ulysses getting published went on to be one of the most prominent pro-Vichy French citizens of Paris. Like the entire like hotbed of culture that we now look back on as modernism created, like it fostered futurists, and it fostered fascism, and it also fostered like basically any concept that we now have of anarchism. It fostered any concept we now have of like social democracy. This was such a teeming pit of ideology that you have people who are basically just like you have these people who spend their entire lives trying to, and even if you have criticisms of Joyce, the man was intentionally doing broadly good things as an artist, and his missions were all very progressive. And you sat down with Kemal Ataturk, and he would have told you all the good things about his fascist regime, and you definitely would not have noticed the genocide going on in that conversation. And it's an amazing thing that of this like 1900 to 1920 period where all of the most progressive people were hanging out with all of the most regressive people, and they were all calling themselves the same thing.
Yeah.
Most of them turned out to be fascists because they just kind of wore themselves into fitting that hole.
I wonder what it was like to have been alive during all of that. Like that's also what I think about, because that is such a great distillation, Will, of all of these different competing things, and kind of what modernism as a whole, as you put, was a hotbed of. But I struggle to think of when that has happened since, especially as things have gotten more and more siloed in like the modern world. That it really, I don't know. It makes me wonder if that was how it felt at the time, that all of this stuff was in competition with one another yet using the same names, or if it was just you went with the flow of what you were around. It's just such an interesting period of history from every point of view. Changes in government to obviously the wars, and then cultural changes and art and all the rest.
Yeah, we had facets of it, like in a very limited sense. And sorry, my dog is deciding to come over by the mic. We had like facets of it in like the 90s through the early 2000s in the Silicon Valley world, which there's a reason Pynchon talks about that in Bleeding Edge, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We had flutters of it with the whole like the optimism around social media that came out of the Arab Spring.
Sure.
Which if you want to be conspiracy minded about that, I'm not going to begrudge you. But there's also people had the ideas that this is what was happening, right? That there was this liberation of people's minds through the internet, and that's really about it, though. Like, because the 60s was not this, as much as people might romanticize the 60s.
Oh yeah, no.
The 60s was like a unidirectional thing as a cultural movement, and sure, you had Charles Manson, but that's different, right? You have individual people who are willing to do horrible things, is a different thing from fomenting fascism as an event in history, right? You don't get that with the 60s. You don't get that with even the interwar period didn't have anything close to that kind of breadth of intellectual experimentation, unfortunately. And I don't know, I mean, if you could simply credit it to the subdivisions of reality. But I mean, I think clearly Pynchon wants us to wonder whether or not that is all of it.
Right. Yeah. I think if maybe if we were to band together and bomb all the data centers tomorrow, maybe we would be able to recreate some of that in what would have to come up afterwards. But yeah, it's just such an interesting period. And in case in case you didn't pick up on it in what Will said, Pynchon is still finding ways to critique modernism in that regard with his writing, even well into his kind of less experimental phase, as a lot of people would refer to it. He's still carrying the postmodern torch, just doing it in a way that's very different than when it was at its sort of height. And so, after he kind of does all of this fascist talk, after he kind of illustrates his perspective on all of these things, which I don't have anything really specific to go over line by line, just because what he is articulating is pretty accurate to both these fascist mindsets, but then also some of the futurist mindset. Like, it's another one of these cases where, to me anyway, it feels like this is pretty clear on the page. Do any of you guys want to add anything to his discourse with Dally, or how do we feel?
I don't think there's anything I could add.
We got green and lavender up at the top of the page.
That's true.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's to say the obvious. It's talking about steamrolling the world so that it's a blank slate.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. That's all the explanation I can imagine needing.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And eventually he shows a painting that he's working on to Dally and to Hunter, and it says it ain't Surat. That is a reference to divisionism. So this particular character's kind of background, and also that did contribute to futurism. He's a very famous divisionist artist, and as Dally's kind of gazing into the abyss in the form of a painting, she suddenly really wants him to kiss her. And that was when I literally left my apartment and I shit you not, I walked around the park and I came back. Cause like it's not even just the fact that I like this character so much that Dally has become like one of my favorite characters, but it's also just like, dude, you do this every time. Like, is there any woman who hurt you? What woman did you meet that did this? Either in your life or in like some commune you were a part of or something, that went and started sleeping with a cop or a fascist or something, that made you so wounded you've done this with like every single one, like all of them? Why? So it was just like a moment of temporary frustration of just like, can we do something else? Can we conceive of a major character not doing this? Especially given that if we're looking at kind of Lake and Dally in relation to one another, and their decisions, that both of them make this decision to fall in love, or maybe fall in love. I haven't read past this yet, with the sort of icon of evil, with Babylon, to use the biblical example I talked about with Bleeding Edge. Like, I don't know. It feels like we don't need to do this every single time.
Yeah. I mean, it's, on the one hand, I get it, because that's, from a character standpoint, Dally's the kind of person who would be most susceptible to this kind of thinking, right? She's the one that would most easily succumb to the faulty logic that exists at the core of all this. But much to your point, Kate, it's always a woman. Why? It's always that. I just don't get it. I don't know if there's something deeper that he's trying to get at. I don't know, but
it's not always a woman is the thing. And
it's true.
It is
okay. Yeah, no, I'm being hyperbolic for sure, but
it is a fucking problem, and this is where a lot of my antipathy was coming out during our Vineland episodes. I think the thing is, I have the most patience. Okay, dog, do not unplug my goddamn computer again.
do it.
I have the most sympathy for his usage of it in this book, when it's so much about the ways that it's not explicitly talked about in this book, if I remember correctly, although they very well may. There's another 500 pages to go through, and it's been a while since I read it. Like the ways that the early feminist movement ended up supporting fascism. Like
Sure.
this is a time period where, like, yeah, unfortunately, 90% of women were raised to think of themselves in such an objectifying way that, like, they did like, condition themselves into believing that, like, the only way for them to be safe was to seek this kind of strong man. However, yeah, what the fuck, man? Can it be a little bit less?
Yeah, dial it
I-
back a little bit at least, please.
Yeah, I like I said, I don't mind it terribly here because it's going for something. Like, it's getting at things, and I get that most people don't like it when characters are treated like devices. But I have a hard time not seeing characters as devices. So I'm just happy that there's someone out there who's willing to do it full-throatedly, because everyone does it. But I recognize most people don't like it, and so yeah, if I put that down to the side and I say, well, okay, let's pretend that Dali's a person. Yeah, what the fuck, man? This is so infuriating. Hunter's like a good guy who is actually, like, in this, and you can even do bullshit like Oedipal shit with the Hunter relationship if you want. You can sit there and say, well, he's like Webb in this way. He's focused on how light is recreated and how you see things as they are, not as they appear to be. Blah blah blah. And so, like, okay, so what is this now? Just Dahlia running away from her dad again? Is that, like, does that feels even worse than the
Yeah.
Yeah.
woman of it all? It's frustrating. It is also, to be fair, like you said, Cody, she's like a 19 or 20-year-old. She's gonna go hook up with the fascist who says these impressive things because that's how
Right.
19-year-olds are.
And especially to your point at this time, that's especially true of that. It's, this guy's talking in a way that, ordinary people didn't talk, and that Dally especially is not used to hearing people talk. So it sounds automatically more educated and therefore more correct. It's the kind of like the British accent problem, right? Where I'm guilty of this all the time. Like, if you say something to me in a British accent, there's a 99% chance I'm going to believe you, whatever it is, because it sounds authoritative. But I don't know. It is a problem with his work in general. Yes. I also do agree with you, Will, that it does work better in this story because of the time and the characters who are responsible for it. So it's kind of a weird, I don't know. I think this is part of what I think makes this book so good, is that this is where, like, everything he's tried doing in different books finally works the way it should. And I don't think anything he did before this really clicked on every level like it does here, and I don't think anything he did after necessarily does either. I think he came closer after a couple of times. I would say Bleeding Edge is probably the closer one, but it's still a thing.
Yeah, let's just to do my usual shtick. Let's keep in mind that it's like I referred to, that, like, hotbed of fascism was a hotbed of a lot of non-fascist things too. Just because this guy is talking like a fascist and is talking about fascist ideals, that doesn't necessarily mean, and specifically the fact that he's, like, repulsed by the brutalism of the American side of futurism, is really one of the it's an indicator that he may not be, like, an inevitable fascist. He might just be someone who's caught up in the moment and is spouting things he's heard, but give it 6 months, he'll get his head right. But he is spouting off fascism right now.
Right. He's at a point of which he could tip either way, really.
Yeah.
And I will say this, it does, taking Dally out of it, it does succeed at showcasing the way in which fascism likes to sort of dress itself up as like an intellectual exercise or an intellectual movement, when in actuality it's not at all.
It used to. It's gotten a little bit.
Yeah, not anymore. Everything's gotten stupider now, but at least when it started, that was what they were engaged in.
Yeah.
This is where I need to make my obligatory reference to, I highly recommend you either watch Mussolini, Son of the Century, the miniseries that came out last year, or even better, read M, Son of the Century by Antonio Scurati. Both of those are really, really excellent pieces of media on Mussolini and on the development of the fascist party and the sort of levers that were pulled to gain access to power and how that went about. The TV show is one of the most interesting stylistic things I've watched in a really, really long time. And it succeeds at telling the sort of narrative events in the way that Scurati did with his novel, but in a shorter span of time, because the novel's very long. But they're very much worth the effort. Do we have anything else on 41 that we want to mention before we close out?
I do think it is worth pointing out. I won't go into it too long, but there is a reference back to Princess Casamassina. Probably saying that wrong because my brain's breaking already. But on 582, the Principessa Spongiatosa is a kind of callback to the book that Pugnax was reading earlier in the book. When I say earlier, like page 6 earlier. The Pension Wiki actually does a pretty good job of breaking down the connections between Henry James's work and this book. So I would just say go check that out because there's some pretty cool stuff that connects there.
Then the only other thing I would add is that in terms of the, working towards an infernal machine, it's or preliminary studies toward an infernal machine. That infernal machine has quite a few different meanings throughout early modernity. Like so many that I can't even start to list them. I think that the simplest ones to point to though would be a gun that had 25 barrels that was designed in the in the early 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
It was just not a good idea.
Why?
Something about we didn't have 5 zeros in our tolerances yet. We couldn't line up everything perfect.
I think if you get an armada of steam submarines and load them up with 25 shot revolvers, you're gonna do good. You're gonna go places.
Well, that would be so much better. That's basically a Maxim gun.
Yeah.
This is just a line of rifles stuck together. In any case, that's the the original infernal machine. The more like literary relevant one that I think might be like both influencing Pynchon here and the character is, thank you, Brain. It's by Jean Cocteau, The Infernal Machine, which is essentially a retelling of the Sophocles story or Sophocles' telling of the Oedipus story, but like deeply layered in like, look at how the gods are ruining this man as the explicit framing text. And I think there's something there. I don't know exactly what, but it's totally something about, it's getting at, the Freud of the era being so ascendant in culture. Like, this guy who is a proto-fascist is looking to this Oedipus story, maybe not looking to it, but drawing from it. Like, this is the future of things, is this constant movement, this constant violence centered around these Oedipal themes.
I think that makes a lot of sense. All right. Are there any funny parts from these two chapters that we want to talk about?
I don't know that there really was that much.
No, not really. Not at least in my opinion.
I mean, just it's a little one. It's a lot of little ones in chapter 41, I'd say. Chapter 40 was fairly dry for the most part, to my eye. But 41 had a lot of little bits, and one of them was 572. You've set my mind at rest, murmured Luca. I don't know how to thank you. Money? Ettore suggested.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Just simple jokes. Sometimes you just want a simple joke.
Yeah, that one did make me laugh. All right. Who's got a quote that they want to read out?
I've got mine right here. This is on
Ooh.
575. This is when Tally is talking to Hunter. All right, a minute or two of pencil work. It wouldn't matter. Imagine that inside this labyrinth you see is another one, but on a smaller scale, reserved only, say, for cats, dogs, and mice. And then inside that, one for ants and flies, then microbes and the whole invisible world. Down and down the scale. For once the labyrinthine principle is allowed, don't you see? Why stop at any scale in particular? It's self-repeating. Exactly the spot where we are now is a microcosm of all Venice. I just love that imagery of just like collapsing down and down and analyzing the further details, whether it's in nature to make a painting like he's talking about here, or as a reader, and taking the larger themes and ideas of the story and kind of collapsing down and down and looking at the finer granularity of it all to kind of see how it's all put together. I think it kind of explores the beauty of not just the world itself, but of art.
All right. My quote is going to be just the sort of Merle's retelling of the Jesus story. I'm not going to read the whole thing because I think it's 5 paragraphs.
Yeah, it's pretty long.
I can cut some of it. Jesus was sort of a hellraiser as a kid, as Merle had told it. The kind of wayward youth I'm always finding you keeping company with, in fact. Not that I'm objecting. As she had sat up in bed and looked for something to assault him with. He used to go around town pulling these adolescent pranks, making whole little critters out of clay, bringing them to life, birds that could fly, rabbits that talked, and like that, driving his parents crazy, not to mention most of the local adults who were always coming by to complain. You better tell that Jesus to watch it. One day he's out with some friends looking for trouble to get into, and they happen to go by the dyer shop, where there's all these pots with different colors of dye and piles of clothes next to them, all sorted and each pile ready to be dyed a different color. Jesus says, "Watch this!" He grabs up all the clothes in one big bundle. The dryer's yelling, "Hey, Jesus, what'd I tell you last time?" Drops what he's doing and goes chasing after the kid. But Jesus is too fast for him. Before anybody can stop him, he dumps all the clothes in and runs away laughing. The dyer screaming bloody murder, tying his Jesus Christ, it's too late. Tearing his beard, thrashing around on the ground, he sees his whole livelihood destroyed. Even Jesus' low-life friends think this time he's gone a little too far. But here comes Jesus with his hand up in the air, just like in the painting, calm as anything. Settle down, everybody. And he starts pulling the clothes out of the pot again, and what do you know? Each one comes out just the color it's supposed to be. Not only that, but the exact shade of that color, too. No more housewives hollering, "Hey, I wanted lime green, not Kelly green. You colorblind or something?" No, this time, each item is the perfect color it was meant to be. And it just goes on from there. But just the reason I picked that isn't that I think it's necessarily the best written segment or the best, imagery or whatever the case may be. But it is illustrative of what spoke to me the most in these 2 chapters, where just I stopped and I was in awe of how that whole scene was depicted, as I kind of referred to my thoughts on earlier. And it's just the framing of it is crazy. The way in which he's able to successfully tell this parable through the voice of another person is really impressive. And it's just it is something where I could totally, even though he made it up, I could totally see that being in one of the Gnostic Gospels or in the collected parables of Jesus from in and out of the canon. It's very successful in that style that he's inhabiting, even if it's just there for that one paragraph.
I do also want to take a moment to appreciate the southern drawl that you affected while you were reading that.
Yeah.
That came dangerously close to Dukes of Hazzard sort of shenanigans. I kept waiting for something like, "Oh, Jesus didn't know how he'd upset them Hazard boys this time," but trouble will come looking for him either way.
Well, I was going to say specifically, do you have a Jim Beaver impression? Because You do.
Nice. Okay, I'll add that one to the repertoire.
I'll need to make note of that for future ads.
Just for some reason, that's the way I read all his dialogue in my head.
I don't blame
that's
you.
exactly how I read him. Yeah.
I'm just saying you did it better than I could have.
Oh, thank you. And that brings us to Will. You got a quote?
Yeah. I'm gonna go with the one that just follows the American Light paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
It's on 581. Here in this ancient town, progressively settling into a mask of itself, she began to look for episodes of counterlight, canal-side gates into dank gloom, soto portici whose exits could not be seen, absent faces, missing lamps at the ends of Cali. So there was revealed to her, night by night in ever more depressing clarity, a secret and tenebrous city, down into whose rat-infested labyrinths she witnessed children her age and younger being drawn, infected, corrupted, and too often made to vanish like a coin or a card, just that interchangeably held in contempt. But those who profited from the limitless appetite for young bodies that seemed to concentrate here from all over Europe and beyond. Now, the subject matter is not great, but the actual language is, I mean, it's beautifully treacly almost.
Yeah.
I don't know how to really describe it, but it's great. Great descriptions of really the energy of the city more than anything.
Right. What's the most pinch on part of the chapter?
I mean, most of chapter 41, you could probably put that on there. But if I had to pin it down to one thing, I'm gonna put it as the final scene of chapter 41. The conversation between Hunter and Dally and Andrea. Like just that sort of exploration, like dancing around the ideologies of fascism without actually stepping into the pool so far. Like I think that typifies a lot of what Pynchon works toward, especially taking into consideration Shadow Ticket now and how that ties into this book specifically.
I look forward to rereading Shadow Ticket.
Absolutely. I look forward to doing a deep dive on that one.
Yeah, after doing Against the Day. Mostly, I just want to experience that bebop and prose again that he does.
Hell yeah.
Shadow Ticket. That was so much fun.
Yeah, it was.
Sorry, I cut you off, Will. What were you gonna say?
Oh, don't worry about it. I was just gonna say, I think my most Pynchon part is actually the fake Jesus story, because that is just so incredibly Pynchon-y. He loves to rewrite old stories. He likes to, give false credit to things, and he likes to make things weirdly Christian. And I,
Fair.
did all three, nailed in one very long paragraph, 3 paragraphs.
Yeah, I would have to second your choice there. Either that or just that whole. Okay, for the purpose of being different, I will pick a different one, and I would say it is just the battle in the abandoned Hanseatic city, and by battle I mean one man shooting at Kit. Because the other thing about that is that scene has a very noir sensibility.
Yeah,
it's all foggy. You can picture jazz music playing in the background as someone shoots at him from across the way. And that blending that love for hard-boiled and noir fiction in with the rest of what he's doing there feels very distinctly Pynchon too. Cody, do we have any correspondence that you want to go over?
We sure do. We got 2 comments on YouTube. The first is from Kali Shakta, who said, "When I think of Kit, I picture Graham Parsons. When I think of Brock Vond, I picture Vincent Bugliosi." I don't know about the Graham Parsons one. That's a Kit as Graham Parsons is a bit of a stretch. Brock Vond is Vincent Bugliosi, though. That one I'd have to think. I'd have to pull up a picture of Vincent Bugliosi because his dumb face hasn't graced my brain in a while.
I could see it. I mean, Vincent Bugliosi, like back in the 60s and 70s when he was famous,
Okay, yeah,
had
for
like
sure.
thinning hair, which I don't picture Brock Von
No,
having.
but you could put a wig on him.
But that face, it's very
Yeah.
sort of chiseled thumb cop face.
Yeah, very smarmy.
In a way that works for well.
I mean, and him as a
for Brock
person
Von.
too, he kind of matches up to Brock Von too. He's not above, manipulating evidence to benefit himself.
What are you talking about?
About Bugliosi?
Yeah, he's a paragon of honesty.
He is,
Cody.
yes, he is a paragon of honesty. You're right.
American
I'm sorry.
virtue in a man.
American, yes.
Yeah.
No wrong done by him.
There's one thing I learned from Chaos. It's that Vincent Bugliosi
God damn it,
is a
that
good
book made me
person.
so mad. It's so good, but it made me so mad.
Also from O Noster. Disappointed you all seem to view chapter 36 as bad and skipped over it so quickly to focus on 37. I really enjoy the Cyprian storyline and was looking forward to your usual in-depth commentary. For me, this was classic Pynchon, and as a queer reader, it never seemed like a misstep. Hopefully you give it another go on your next read rather than skipping it. I mean, I can't speak to the queer perspective at all. What I can speak to is I agree it's classic Pynchon. I said, I think briefly in that episode that it's not. It's classic Pynchon in not necessarily a way that I love, to be honest. But I get what you're saying, and I mean, we're gonna see Cyprian. We'll get more of him.
I think Cyprian as a character, he's one of my favorite characters in the book. I just don't think that chapter was the best place to really discuss his arc because it's so little of him. But I think also like to I don't want to like sit here and overly defend our choice to not talk about that chapter as much, but I think with that set of chapters, there was just so much more to talk about in 37, and I think a lot of us just felt not a frustration, but just like I don't know what the right word would be, but it basically like 36 just felt like, I don't know, just felt a little off. So could we go back and reevaluate it? Probably. And we could probably pull some fun stuff out of there, but I think there was just more about 37 to discuss at that time.
Yeah, I don't know. People have their own interpretations and experiences with these chapters. I would say that, for me speaking as a queer person, like I did not personally see a lot of great representation out of that, but that my interpretation of that is not sort of written in a stone tablet. There are going to be people who have totally different experiences from me and think that there is some worthwhile representation there. I think what it really comes across as to me, though, more than anything else, and I think I kind of said this in the last episode, is there just felt like a laziness applied to the Cambridge sort of culture and to the sort of queerness of that culture on campus, and then how that is manifesting in these characters in a way that is strictly within your understanding of them non-normative. I'm just not really all that interested in that, I think. And it's possible I did myself a disservice in it, but it feels like compared to what he has done to this point with table setting for his other locations, his other characters, and for the Great War and all of these different movements in science and technology, that in comparison to all of that, it just feels really weak. It just feels really weak, and it feels almost written by a different person in terms of its quality. It doesn't give enough actual detail or context. It's pretty short compared to a lot of the other stuff. And again, it's the choice to depict both of them as having these I don't know, it seems like they have a bit of a disordered relationship to their sexuality or to the milieu that they're coming out of. And Will, I think, very smartly elucidated why that's the case, but I don't love that being the choice of depiction. I think there was other ways that he could have done it that would have got the point across that Will very smartly made in the episode without choosing to use queer characters in the way that he did. But that's a matter of personal perspective. If it worked for you, it
Sure.
worked for you.
So here's the thing. I'm gonna say two things to kind of finish this thought out. Number one, the Cyprian and Yasmin representation, it gets better. It gets a lot better, actually. And that's something that I have seen come up in discourse on this book in the past. So I think if I don't want to jump the gun and talk about things that happen hundreds of pages from now, but I will say that from my past readings of this, especially for a book written by a cis white man in the year 2007 and prior to that, because this book was obviously written over a long period of time, the representation gets much better. And I don't think that chapter 36 does a good job of really setting that up. I think that's a weak point that has gone unnoticed by me in the past. And I think maybe it's gone unnoticed because of how much better it gets as it goes along. My second point is, and this is no disrespect to any of our listeners, really, the number of things that we don't get to talk about in these conversations. We're already pushing 4 hours for this episode, I'm sure. I know for me in my book, like there are tons of notes and sections that I've underlined or annotated that just never come up because it's just the way that the show's designed. And when we joke about like we could talk about this book or his works or these sections ad nauseum for hours, I mean that. Like I genuinely could spend a day talking about a handful of these chapters. And I don't want to speak for my co-hosts, but I think that's part of why we gelled so well making this podcast, is because we all kind of have that same passion for it. But we all know also from a listening perspective, it's already enough to expect our listeners to sit here and listen to us blather for 4 hours, let alone doubling that length just so we can cover everything. So there's always going to be things that come up. And that's why we want people to reach out and tell us, this, we missed this, or I wish you had talked about this more, because it does, if we can't go back and talk about it, because God knows we're not going to cover this book again once we should.
Well, you guys aren't made for that.
Yeah. So, but I think it furthers the discussion for people listening and for people who have discussions outside of this podcast, right? I think it gives everyone else the opportunity to like use what we're talking about as a jumping off point and find other areas of discussion to talk about. But it is nice to be told when we've missed something or to bring something like that up. So please don't take it as, like never point out where we missed something. Like always point out where we missed shit. We just might not have the time to talk about it as much as we'd like to.
Yeah, for anyone like I am probably the most fly by the seats of the pants member of this podcast when it comes to preparing. Maybe not the close to it. And whenever I've hosted the show, I have ended up with like 3 times as many notes as have gotten used. We really could spend hours talking about it. And we've talked about, sitting down and instead of doing this book club style show, we could sit down and have these conversations and, keep minutes or record them and then go back through and then re-record like more of a formal
bullet point everything.
Yeah, like a not conversation, more of a real presentation of what we came to. And we decided that would be lame as hell. First of all, it would like quintuple the amount of work we do, which is not really the problem. It's more that you'd end up with, shorter episodes with less fun for all of us. And it would be like reading an encyclopedia out loud to you, frankly, if we tried to actually compile every single connection that each of us comes across in these chapters, it would take just as long, and it would be us talking nonstop with no breaks for levity or air. So yeah, like Cody said, please tell us when you think we've missed something, when you think we've overlooked something. And I know that I, in particular, have been very short with listeners who've given us corrections before in the past. And please give me an excuse. That's what I'm saying here. Be the glutton for my punishment, or prove me wrong.
Get in the comments, as Brendan Lee Mulligan would say.
There you go. All right. This might be our longest episode of this book yet.
Hell yeah.
But as always, thank you all for listening. Thank you for supporting the show in all the ways that you do by listening and commenting. If you are interested in getting in touch with us, like the two YouTube listeners did for this episode, you can do so in a number of ways that aren't YouTube. You can reach out to us on Instagram. We're there at Mapping the Zone Podcast. We are on Twitter at PinchOnPod. We're at Blue Sky at we're on Blue Sky at is how that should go, Mapping the Zone Podcast. You can also reach out to us on email. That's the most direct way to contact us at mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. We do have an ongoing Ko-Fi project running in the background. If you think this show is worth $1, then we would love to have that dollar. You can donate it to us at our Ko-Fi project. Ko-Fi in the Zone is where we are listed there as well. If, however, you would like your donation to the show to come with something tangible in response, we got a shirt order just a couple days ago from somebody on our spread shop, where you can purchase shirts and tote bags and mugs and stickers and all sorts of stuff that is going to have either the logo that was so lovingly created for us by Brad per second off of the subreddit, or a shirt with the original motto of the Enfield Tennis Academy. At some point, we will come up with something else to put on there, but it's just a matter of figuring out what that should be. And any of the funds that we receive, either through Ko-Fi or through our spread shop, will be used to pay right back into the show, either by purchasing books or movie tickets in some most recent cases, or just paying our hosting fees, which is honestly what we use most of that money for. Any of that money will be earmarked to improve the show. And I just want to, again, sincerely thank everybody who has donated to the show. It has been super consistent over the course of Against the Day in a way that has been super encouraging for us to hear and or for us to see. Jesus, it's late. And this is what people listen to the show for. They the realness.
Yeah.
No practiced ad reads here.
When our brains start melting and we can't talk good.
I barely know what I'm saying at this point. But no, I sincerely thank you to everyone who has donated. That has made making this show easier when it comes to buying resources that we use. But mostly, it has given us a peace of mind over the fact that we will not have to make decisions like what episodes stay online for people to access. Because at this point, our RSS feed is pretty meaty with the content that we've produced in the last 4 years almost. Next episode, we will be covering, chapters 42 and 43. That is going to be pages 589 through 615. Cody, do you have the line for folks with the different pagination for us?
Last line. And he withdrew again out into the empty suburban lamplight, the stridently unpopulated evening.
As always, thank you so much for listening.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye!